East St. Louis, once conceived as an industrial titan, a junction of railways, slaughterhouses, factories, and transport networks, erected along the Mississippi River during the 19th century. It became one of Illinois' most populous municipalities by mid-century, its residents bound to the rhythm of mechanized labor. The eruption of racial violence in 1917, fueled by labor tensions, competition for jobs, and a climate of racial resentment, exacted a grim toll. Scores of black citizens were murdered, their neighborhoods obliterated, and municipal order validated the atrocity through indifference or complicity. That massacre marked an enduring inflection in the city's trajectory. By the 1960s, industrial divestment invaded. Major employers departed, draining the city's revenue and leaving it incapable of providing elementary governance. Infrastructure failed. Streetlights remained unreplaced, buildings were abandoned mid-renovation, and the fire department was overwhelmed. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, East St. Louis amassed one of the nation's highest per capita homicide rates, averaging some 57 murders annually. While its police departments, starved financially, lacked operational radios and endured siloed communication across jurisdictions. In 1989 alone, the city recorded 63 homicides. With a population of barely 40,000 at the time, this gave East St. Louis the highest per capita murder rate in the entire United States, outpacing cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, where the raw number of killings was higher but dispersed across millions of residents. Here, the concentration of bloodshed was unparalleled. Murder was not an outlier, but a statistical constant. The concentration of death in East St. Louis was staggering. Its homicide rate eclipsed not only American metropolises, but also rivaled the most violent regions of the globe. In some years, the odds of being murdered in East St. Louis were greater than in Medellin, Colombia, then regarded as the epicenter of cartel violence. International conflict zones often reported lower per capita death rates than this American city, sitting in the heart of Illinois. To call it a municipality was a technicality. In reality, it had become a killing ground where violence was as consistent as taxation elsewhere. But the numbers alone fail to convey the reality of life in East St. Louis during these years. Violence was omnipresent. Gunfire rang out with such frequency that it ceased to shock. Entire neighborhoods operated as open-air drug markets, where disputes were settled not with negotiation, but with gunfire in broad daylight. Murders, assaults, rapes, and robberies stacked on top of one another, until they blurred into routine. Mothers buried their sons with grim regularity, and the morgue often exceeded its capacity. The city's police force was crippled, both financially and operationally. Patrol cars often sat idle for lack of gasoline. Radios failed, leaving officers unable to communicate during emergencies. At times, there were barely enough officers on duty to respond to calls, and even when they did arrive, backup could be miles away or never come at all. Detectives carried caseloads so overwhelming that many homicides went uninvestigated for months, some never solved at all. Evidence was misplaced, reports went unfinished, and entire investigations collapsed under the sheer weight of dysfunction. Fires gutted abandoned properties nightly, stretching the depleted fire department beyond its limits. Trash lay uncollected until it rotted in alleys, feeding vermin. Schools served more as warehouses for youth than centers of learning, their roofs leaking, their textbooks outdated by decades. Civic order had not simply eroded, it had been extinguished. Children grew up amid this chaos, their understanding of normality shaped by violence. They learned early that the crack of a gunshot was more reliable than the sound of a siren. They internalized that survival depended on instinct rather than authority, because authority had become a hollow promise. In East St. Louis, the line between criminal and victim blurred. Everyone was vulnerable, and no one could count on the law to intervene. The misery of East St. Louis was made sharper by its proximity to Belleville, the seat of St. Clair County. Just a short drive away, Belleville maintained a veneer of order. Police responded to calls, garbage was collected, and schools retained accreditation. Its residents lived with the expectation that the city would function, that civic institutions would shield them from disorder. For the people of East St. Louis, this contrast was corrosive. Belleville's stability stood as a constant reminder of their abandonment. Families who could afford to flee often crossed the boundary, searching for safe streets and functional classrooms. Those who remained looked across that invisible divide with bitterness, aware that geography alone determined whether a child would be educated in a classroom with heat and books, or left in a crumbling building where hope had already fled. Tensions simmered between the two cities. Belleville residents regarded East St. Louis as a reservoir of crime and instability, wary of its citizens spilling across the boundary. Meanwhile, East St. Louisans saw Belleville as a community that hoarded resources and reinforced their exclusion. The migration of families into Belleville was met with suspicion, further widening the gulf between the two populations. The disparity was not abstract. It was lived. To grow up in East St. Louis was to know constant vulnerability. To grow up in Belleville was to inherit at least the promise of order. The boundary between them was less a county line than a dividing wall between two irreconcilable worlds. It was within this crucible of violence, neglect, and disparity that Lorenzo Fayne came of age. The civic collapse of East St. Louis was not a distant condition. It was the air he breathed and the ground beneath his feet. And just as East St. Louis had become a place where lawlessness outpaced law, Fayne himself would evolve into a figure who embodied the violence around him, reshaping it into something even more terrifying. Lorenzo Fayne was not created in a single act of violence, nor in the moment of his first murder. He was constructed, layer by layer, year after year, by the brutality of those meant to protect him. His life was not a deviation from the ordinary. It was a design, a murderous recipe, as his attorney John O'Gara would later call it. The collision of genetic damage, relentless abuse, and a home steeped in degradation. From the beginning, Fayne's existence was marked by affliction. He was born in Milwaukee in 1971, the child of Juanita Smith, a dancer, heavy drinker, and drug addict, and a father permanently scarred by Vietnam. Doctors testified that his mother drank so heavily during pregnancy that she may have inflicted brain damage before her son ever drew his first breath. His father returned from war fractured, consumed by trauma and addiction. Not long after Lorenzo's birth, he disappeared entirely, leaving no memory, no presence, no guidance. What replaced him was worse. Juanita remarried, binding her family to a man as addicted and unstable as she was. Discipline in that household was not correction. It was torment. Lorenzo was tied to poles, beaten into unconsciousness, and locked in attics for defiance. His sister Lawanda still remembers the sound of his cries, recalling how their stepfather would mete out punishment with ritualized cruelty. She hit him as hard as she could in the head with anything she could get her hands on, one investigator testified. The weapons were whatever lay within reach: skillets, belts, brooms, and fists. Relatives recalled an incident when Lorenzo was only 8. After retrieving a simple handful of crackers from the refrigerator, his stepfather seized him by the throat and choked him until he lost consciousness. Psychologist Dr. Daniel Cuneo, who later evaluated Fayne, told the jury, "Lorenzo Fayne had the most horrendous family history I've ever seen in my 24 years of practice." Another social worker echoed, "If you wanted to produce a killer, one would raise him the way Lorenzo Fayne has been raised." The child himself bore the scars. Repeated blows left him with neurological damage, a brain so battered that experts argued it impaired his impulse control and distorted his personality. Dr. Michael Gellert, a neurologist, testified that Fayne showed signs of frontal lobe dysfunction, damage that eroded self-control and left him volatile, impulsive, and emotionally erratic. Certainly in many cases of brain impairment, he explained, a person loses the capacity to control behavior in a normal fashion. But the brutality did not end with beatings. From his earliest years, Fayne was forced to witness violent domestic battles, his mother brawling with family members, once attacked with a sledgehammer and stabbed by her own partner. Additionally, he witnessed his mother be raped by his stepfather, and once while they walked home crossing through an alleyway. He was also humiliated and attacked outside the home. At just 7 or 8, a neighborhood boy brutally raped him, while his stepfather punished him afterward for allowing it to happen. By adolescence, He had been branded by neighbors as a little pervert, treated as a spectacle of shame rather than a child in need of help. By 9 years old, Lorenzo was already speaking to psychiatrists about experiences no child should endure. By 10, his mother told a social worker that he was acting a little weird and asked that he be removed from her home. At 11, he was drinking alcohol regularly. By 14, he was a habitual marijuana user. His adolescence unfolded inside institutions. Juvenile centers and group homes became revolving doors, brief incarcerations followed by releases into the same chaos. When he was 10, the first night he was there, he was brutally raped by another inmate. At 13, frail and barely 90 pounds, he was placed in a group home where he was raped by older residents. At 14, he was raped again in another juvenile facility. At one detention center, staff noted his disturbing behavior, graphic sexual comments, obsessive fixations, eruptions of violence. One incident led to his arrest for choking and assaulting another boy. The testimonies about his adolescence read like an anatomy of destruction. He was taken by an aunt to taverns, where grown women treated him as a sexual object. He was mocked by peers, ridiculed by adults, degraded by his stepfather until unconscious. His grandmother recalled how he would break down in tears at her home, begging for normalcy, confessing that something inside him was wrong. He badly wanted a mother, she told the court. Yet even his brief sources of refuge dissolved. His grandmother eventually died. His mother remarried and vanished again. His half-brother, Edward Brantley, who admitted to brutalizing Fayne himself, would later be convicted in Wisconsin of killing an infant after fracturing the child's skull. Fayne's attorney summarized the collapse of his support system with a single chilling sentence. Everyone he's ever loved has left him. His grandmother died. His wife divorced him. His mother didn't show up, again. By the time experts evaluated him in prison, Fayne's psychological profile was a portrait of ruin. His IQ fell just below normal, his emotional capacity crippled by abuse. He showed antisocial traits, bursts of rage, and a grotesquely distorted sense of sex and control. But these same experts made it clear. While Fayne's background might explain his compulsions, it could never excuse what followed. There's no excuse for killing and raping 5 people, Dr. Cuneo testified flatly. And yet when Fayne himself was asked why, he revealed only confusion. He once turned to a psychologist and pleaded, "Doc, can you or somebody look inside my head and tell me why I did this?" The answer was already written in the ledger of his childhood. Fayne was not born monstrous. He was manufactured, born to a mother whose drinking poisoned him in the womb, raised by a stepfather who beat him senseless, mocked by neighbors, abused by peers and adults, abandoned by everyone he ever trusted, repeatedly injured until his brain could no longer govern his impulses. If one were to construct a killer deliberately, as one expert said, you would raise him as Lorenzo Fayne was raised. This was not nurture nor neglect. It was corrosion. Systematic, unrelenting, absolute. And by the time Lorenzo Fayne walked out of a juvenile facility at 17, the child who once cried at his grandmother's doorstep no longer existed. In his place was a disturbed vessel of rage, compulsion, and pathology, a boy meticulously sculpted into a predator. By the summer of 1989, Lorenzo Fayne had already walked a jagged path of delinquency and frustration. Raised amid instability and abuse, his life was a cauldron of suppressed rage, fractured impulses, and a festering sense of inadequacy. He was a young man drifting between Milwaukee and East St. Louis, carrying with him a hunger that defied reason. Fayne's descent into violence would not begin with an adult adversary, nor even a peer. His first known victim was a child, plucked from the safety of a neighborhood evening and delivered into horror. East St. Louis, July 14, 1989. The summer air of East St. Louis was heavy that evening, thick with humidity and the faint echoes of children's laughter weaving through the streets of the Parkside neighborhood. 2 6-year-old boys, cousins bound by innocence, played outside their homes as twilight fell. They were oblivious to the danger lurking nearby, a predator whose hunger had brought him into their orbit. A man approached. his voice carrying the lure of opportunity. He asked if they wanted to earn a little money. The offer, so simple and disarming, carried with it a trap the children could not perceive. One boy hesitated, wary. The other, Ari Hunt, small and trusting, accepted. He followed the stranger toward the expanse of Frank Holton State Park, unaware that he was walking directly into the abyss. Ari never returned. That night, when the cousin who had refused the offer spoke up, his revelation ignited panic. Families called the police and a frantic search commenced. Officers scoured the parkland, flashlights cutting through the darkness. At 2 a.m., beneath the viaduct that carried Interstate 255, they found him. The Ari's body lay beneath the concrete underpass, shattered by brutality. Fayne directed the child underneath an underpass and twisted his neck until it snapped. The violence was merciless, the act both savage and deliberate. The boy went limp, but made some gurgling noises, so Fayne picked him up and slammed his head against a concrete wall, an unforgiving structure, his small frame reduced to a lifeless vessel. Then evil fully consumed Fayne. After the brutal killing, he desecrated Ari's small body by his corpse. When he was finished, he dragged the child into the weeds near the viaduct, abandoning him with the same disregard one might show for garbage. To Fayne, Ari was no longer a boy with a family, a laugh, a future. He was discarded, stripped of his humanity. The Illinois State Police Violent Crimes Unit descended upon the scene. Detectives believed they had a chance at justice. There were clues. The killer knew the neighborhood well enough to call Ari's brother by name. A bloody thumbprint was found pressed against the boy's thigh. A hauntingly personal signature, left in arrogance or haste. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, fingerprinting every man who lived nearby. Yet the murderer had already vanished. Lorenzo Fayne had slipped away to Milwaukee, blending back into his old haunts, leaving Parkside haunted by grief and unanswered questions. Years later, when pressed by psychologists, Fayne revealed the depth of his monstrous compulsion. That night, he claimed he had prowled the streets looking for somebody, anybody. The killing, he said, was driven not by plan but by impulse, an eruption of his dark appetite. In his confession to police, Fayne admitted a grotesque detail. He wanted to hear the sound of a neck snapping. Thus began his reign of terror. A crime so vicious it should have shattered the illusion of safety forever. Yet, it was only the first of many. October 4th, 1989, East St. Louis. Barely 3 months after the slaying of Ari Hunt, the fragile calm of East St. Louis shattered again. On the evening of October 4th, 1989, 16-year-old Nicole Willis, an honor roll student at Cahokia High School, stepped off a bi-state bus and began her familiar 10-minute walk home. The path was routine, unremarkable, one she had traced countless times before. Yet on this night, the most ordinary of journeys would deliver her into a nightmare. Nicole never arrived. Later, her body was discovered in a vacant lot, lying face up beneath the indifferent sky. Her head showing the unmistakable signs of blunt trauma, beaten savagely in an attack that left no chance for survival. The lot itself was a block from the site of Ari Hunt's abduction, as if the killer were leaving a macabre calling card in the very heart of the neighborhood. The autopsy revealed the appalling depths of the assault. Nicole had been sexually assaulted, then subjected to further desecration, her dignity stripped away in a manner that bespoke not only cruelty, but an intent to degrade even in death. It was more than murder. It was an act of obliteration designed to scar both victim and community. Detectives immediately recognized the echoes of Ari's fate. The proximity, the brutality, the grotesque treatment of the body, all bore the hallmarks of a predator who was not finished. Many investigators believed Lorenzo Fayne was responsible. His pathology fit, his proximity made sense. But for all their suspicions, they lacked the evidence to anchor him to that night. By early 1990, Fayne had returned to Milwaukee. There, he stole a car, was arrested, and spent 19 months in prison. To some, it explained the sudden lull in killings. Yet when confronted later, Fayne vehemently denied any involvement in Nicole Willis's death. He admitted to 5 murders, but in this case he drew the line, as though her death occupied a separate, shadowed space in his conscience. He was later ruled out by DNA evidence, and Nicole's murder remains a cold case to this day. For Nicole's family, the denial was meaningless. Their daughter, bright and ambitious, was gone, her life extinguished within a stone's throw of her own home. To the community, her murder was proof that the predator haunting East St. Louis was both remorseless and unrelenting. And when Fayne emerged from prison in 1992, the killings resumed, as though his imprisonment had been nothing more than an intermission in his descent into monstrosity. On March 20, 1992, the fragile normalcy of a spring evening in East St. Louis dissolved into one of the most brutal crimes the city would ever endure. Latondra Dean, only 14 years old, was a runaway searching for stability. That night she played cards with friends, laughter and conversation disguising the danger that sat quietly among them. Lorenzo Fayne was there too, his presence unremarkable, his demeanor giving no hint of the horror he was about to unleash. Later, when Latondra returned to the home where she was staying, Fayne followed. It was an intrusion cloaked in familiarity, the kind of act that raised no alarm until it was far too late. Inside, he sat with her on the couch as music played in the background, a scene that should have been ordinary, but in Fayne's mind something malignant was stirring. When he walked to the kitchen for a drink of water, his eyes caught on a knife. He picked it up, not by accident, but with deliberate intent. What followed was an eruption of violence that turned an everyday moment into a nightmare. Fayne forced Latondra into a bedroom, where he violently raped her, then attacked with the knife in a frenzy that spoke of both control and cruelty. He stabbed her 21 times, the blade punctuating her final moments with unspeakable brutality. Even after her life was extinguished, Fayne's actions revealed a calculating coldness. He attempted to wash her body, an effort to conceal what he had done, before leaving her submerged in a bathtub. It was not remorse that guided his hands, but an attempt to erase the traces of his crime, to make the evidence of his savagery vanish into silence. For Mary Dean, Latondra's mother, the discovery shattered her world. The grief was unbearable, the loss impossible to articulate. Her anguish hardened into fury, expressed in words that still echo with raw pain. If Fayne gets the death penalty, I would like to be the one who pulls the cord ending his life. It was the voice of a parent left to bury her child, condemned to carry the weight of a future stolen by violence. When Fayne later recounted the events to a psychiatrist, he spoke of them not with shame, but with an unnerving detachment, as though describing a casual decision instead of a life destroyed. His testimony exposed the chilling truth, that the murder of Latondra Dean was not an explosion of passion, but the calculated choice of a predator who recognized opportunity and seized it with lethal resolve. 4 months after the slaying of Latondra Dean, the city of East St. Louis was plunged once again into collective mourning. On July 20th, 1992, the fragile innocence of a child's summer day was stolen in a manner so brazen, so grotesque, that it reverberated through the very soul of the community. Fallon Flood, 9 years old, had spent her afternoon at a summer lunch program held at East St. Louis High School. When she failed to return home, her mother's instinct told her something was wrong. She went searching the halls where her daughter was last seen, driven by the gnawing dread every parent fears but prays never to face. A gym teacher conducting a search made the grim discovery. Fallon was found inside a locker room, strangled with a belt. Her body hung in silence, a grotesque tableau that transformed an institution of learning into a mausoleum. The details made the horror sharper, a belt twisted into a tool of death, her underwear pulled down to her ankles, her small figure left desecrated in the very place where children should have felt safest. Autopsies later revealed the child was raped. Fallon had last been seen alive with another girl when Fayne approached them. He told Fallon to follow him, instructing the other child to leave. That single command, so easily given, so easily obeyed, marked the last living moments of Fallon's life. The crime was not just a murder, it was a violation of sacred space. To kill a child inside a school was to puncture the illusion of safety, to announce that even the most protected sanctuaries were vulnerable. The city erupted in outrage. Law enforcement, under crushing pressure, offered a $5,500 reward for information, desperate to restore public faith. Yet desperation bred catastrophe. Lorenzo Fayne, who worked as a janitor at the school, was briefly questioned but released without suspicion. Instead, investigators turned their focus to Charles King, another janitor, just 17 years old, with an intellectual disability that rendered him defenseless against manipulation. His IQ was measured at 57, leaving him with the comprehension of a child. Interrogated for days, King ultimately signed a confession he could not possibly understand. In his cell, he asked guards when his coloring books would arrive, unaware that the weight of a murder charge pressed down on him. For an entire year, an innocent boy languished in jail, branded as the killer of Fallon Flood, while the true predator had already slipped away. Fayne returned to Milwaukee, free to breathe, free to walk, free to stalk new victims. Only later, when Fayne confessed, would the truth finally surface. Fallon's death had been his all along. Thus, Fallon's tragedy carried a double wound: the murder of a child and the destruction of another innocent life through wrongful prosecution. Her name became synonymous not only with innocence lost, but also with systemic failure, a lesson in how predators can flourish when fear and haste override justice. By the summer of 1993, East St. Louis was a city fraying at the seams. The streets of the Parkside neighborhood pulsed with drugs, transient figures, and the constant hum of crime. Yet many still believed that the earlier murders of children were random, isolated acts. That belief would prove fatally naive. On June 25, 1993, Fayne returned from Milwaukee and once again prowled the city. He spotted Glenda Jones, a 17-year-old girl, as she cut across an open field behind Martin Luther King Jr. High School. To her, it was a shortcut home, a familiar route across a stretch of land she had no reason to fear. To him, it was opportunity. Glenda's mother, Ernestine Slaughter, later reflected on her own tragic miscalculation. "At the time, I really didn't think about it. I didn't think somebody was targeting kids," she admitted, words weighted with unbearable hindsight. She, like many others, believed the murders had been chance encounters, never suspecting that a single predator was weaving them into a pattern. Fayne closed in as Glenda crossed the field. What unfolded was swift and merciless. He stabbed her repeatedly, each thrust extinguishing the light of a young life not yet lived to its fullness. Death did not satisfy him. After killing her, he ripped her body, leaving behind not just a body but a crime scene that revealed the depths of his cruelty. For her mother, the loss was cataclysmic. What had once been dismissed as random violence became horrifyingly personal. The predator was not some abstract figure haunting other families. He had hunted her daughter, cut her down, and scarred her memory forever. Glenda's murder marked a turning point. The facade of randomness shattered. The killings were not isolated tragedies but deliberate acts in a calculated progression. Fayne had revealed himself as a serial predator, escalating in boldness and brutality with each victim. He moved through East St. Louis like a phantom, invisible until the devastation he left behind forced recognition. Together, the murders of Fallon Flood and Glenda Jones revealed a pattern too dark to ignore. Fayne was not a man who killed by accident or in passing fury. He selected, pursued, and destroyed. He exploited trust, vulnerability, and the fractured systems around him. In the span of 1 year, he claimed victims of 2 generations, a 9-year-old child and a 17-year-old on the cusp of adulthood. In doing so, Fayne left behind not only the ruined lives of his victims, but also a community steeped in paranoia and sorrow. Parents no longer saw schools as sanctuaries. Mothers no longer trusted that shortcuts home were safe. East St. Louis, already battered by poverty and crime, now lived under the shadow of a predator who proved that safety was an illusion. By the summer of 1993, East St. Louis was already a city suffocating under fear. The murder of Glenda Jones had left the community shaken, but the violence had not yet reached its peak. Barely a month later, on a day drenched in heat and tension, Firefighters were summoned to a blaze at the home of Annette Davis. They extinguished the flames only to uncover something far more harrowing than fire damage. Inside lay the body of Annette's 17-year-old daughter, Faith Davis. She had been stabbed to death. The fire, investigators soon discovered, was no accident. It had been set deliberately, a cruel attempt to reduce evidence to ash. Yet the perpetrator's effort to erase his crime only left behind more clues. Detectives combed the scene meticulously. Behind the Davis home, they noticed a dark, glistening trail that stretched into the night. Blood droplets marked a path like breadcrumbs leading to another house, the residence of Lee Fayne, aunt of the man whose name was already whispered among investigators, Lorenzo Fayne. Lee told officers her nephew had injured his hand and gone to St. Mary's Hospital in East St. Louis for treatment. Yet when police checked the hospital records, no one named Fayne had been admitted. Instead, paramedics revealed they had transported a young man who identified himself as Adam Smith, claiming he had cut his hand on a broken mirror. The deception unraveled quickly. Adam Smith was the name of a neighborhood youth who, as it turned out, was locked in juvenile detention at the time. Fayne had cloaked himself in the stolen identity, but the mask slipped. By that very day, police arrested him at his grandmother's home. When confronted, Fayne constructed a cold narrative of Faith's final moments. He admitted he had been burglarizing the Davis residence, passing stolen items out of the window to two accomplices waiting outside. Faith, armed with a knife, had attempted to defend her home. In the struggle, Fayne's hand was cut as he wrestled the blade away from her. He then used it against her, stabbing her repeatedly in a violent storm that left her broken on the floor. He stepped outside afterward, bloodied and breathless, and told his companions what had occurred. Overcome by fear, they fled into the night. But Fayne did not run. Instead, he returned inside, alone with the silence and the corpse of his victim. What followed revealed the full scope of his depravity. Fayne desecrated Faith's body after her death, an act that stripped away not only her life but her dignity. Then, in an effort to obliterate evidence, he set the house ablaze, hoping the fire would consume his crime in smoke and flame. But the flames betrayed him. The fire summoned rescuers whose hoses and axes uncovered not only Faith's body, but the trail that led back to him. The blood on the ground, the false name at the hospital, the cut on his hand, each piece tied the crime irrevocably to Lorenzo Fayne. Faith Davis was only 17, her youth stolen in a storm of violence and fire. The brazenness of the crime, a home invasion turned into murder, desecration, and arson, confirmed the escalating nature of Fayne's brutality. He was no longer content to stalk the vulnerable in alleys and fields. Now he invaded the sanctity of a family's home, and when confronted, he answered with murder. Her death marked another turning point in the dark catalog of Fayne's crimes, demonstrating that his hunger for destruction was not random but ever-expanding, pushing further into acts of depravity. When detectives first placed Lorenzo Fayne in custody, they didn't yet understand the magnitude of the monster they had captured. At the time, he was just another suspect in the killing of Faith Davis, a 17-year-old found stabbed to death in her burning home. But soon, small fragments of evidence began to converge into a revelation so grim, it altered the very way East St. Louis would remember its own history. The Illinois State Police were brought in to help interrogate him. Fayne, aloof and calculating, showed little interest in most officers, but he warmed to Special Agent Joe Bates, a man who sensed from the start that Fayne's crimes ran deeper than what had yet been uncovered. 10 days after Fayne's arrest, forensic results confirmed it. A bloody thumbprint found on the leg of 6-year-old Ari Hunt matched Fayne. The proof was irrefutable. With that evidence laid before him, Fayne admitted the truth. There was more to tell. For the first time, police realized they were not chasing a series of isolated tragedies. They had a serial killer. Bates cut short his vacation, returned, and spent 2 exhaustive days listening as Fayne began to unravel his secrets. What spilled out were 5 confessions, each one another nail in the coffin of innocence for families already broken. As Detective Crenshaw later remarked, realistically he could still be killing if he hadn't cut his hand. The wound from Faith Davis's knife, the slip of blood that betrayed him, had been the crack in the mask. Without it, Fayne might have continued prowling the streets, his appetite unchecked. For the families, Fayne's confessions were not revelations. They were confirmations of nightmares they had already endured. Their grief did not subside with answers. It sharpened into fury. Gloria Flood, mother of 9-year-old Fallon, cannot expel the vision from her mind. Her daughter being led down the corridor of East St. Louis High, taken toward the locker room where she would be strangled and left hanging. Sitting in her living room, a portrait of Fallon nearby, the girl in a bright floral dress, smiling shyly with her arm around her brother. Gloria's words spill out haltingly. For someone to hang you in a locker like you were nothing. Her grief is not softened by financial restitution. Though the school district later reached a settlement, Gloria insists money can never return what Fayne took. My daughter was just a baby. He just took everything away from her. She is not alone. Mary Dean, whose 14-year-old daughter Latondra was raped and stabbed 21 times, speaks with volcanic rage. If Fayne gets the death penalty, I would like to be the one who pulls the cord ending his life. The same demand echoes from Dessie Wayham, mother of Ari Hunt. Her 6-year-old son's body had been left broken in weeds, a thumbprint pressed into his leg like a signature of ownership. Dessie moved away from Parkside afterward, unable to endure the proximity of a neighborhood where her child's killer had lived only blocks away. When I would go places and see people, I would wonder if they had done it. Her trust in humanity had dissolved into suspicion. She packed away nearly every photograph of her boy, unable to face them, leaving only one above her bed. Twice each year she travels to Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, where his small headstone sits among rows of others claimed by war. Though Ari's battle had been nothing but survival in a city that could not protect him. At Fayne's trial, Dessie sat through the reading of his confession. Even then, she wrestled with questions that gnawed at her faith. I feel like I haven't done anything bad in my life. I feel like I was a good mother. It's hard to question the Lord. Sometimes I feel like I've been cheated. The family's demand for the death penalty was not fueled by abstract vengeance. It was born from the images that would never leave them. Fallon's body strung up in a locker as though she were refuse. Latondra's bloodied frame left in a bathtub. Ari's corpse discarded in weeds. Glenda's body desecrated in a field. Faith's house set ablaze to hide the mutilation within. Fayne's confession stripped away any lingering illusions. He was not a man who killed in a moment of rage. He was a predator who stalked, calculated, and destroyed. He desecrated the living and the dead alike, and each time he walked away, he left behind families condemned to a lifetime of grief. For East St. Louis, the capture of Lorenzo Fayne revealed a chilling truth. Evil had walked openly among them, shaking hands, playing cards, pushing brooms as a janitor, all while harboring the cold intent to slaughter. And but for a slip of a knife that cut his hand and spilled his blood, he might have remained invisible, killing still. In the early 1990s, the name Lorenzo Fayne began to circulate in whispers through the neighborhoods of East St. Louis, not merely as a suspect, but as a specter. He had already confessed to killing 5 children: Ari Hunt, Fallon Flood, Glenda Jones, Latondra Dean, and Faith Davis. Yet the path from confession to sentencing would prove as tortured as the crimes themselves. The courtrooms of St. Clair County became theaters of anguish, where families of the slain were forced to sit through the unbearable retelling of how their children were stolen. Prosecutors moved swiftly to indict Fayne for multiple murders, beginning with the most haunting of them all, the 1989 killing of 6-year-old Ari Hunt. It was the first case to go before a jury, a deliberate strategy by state's attorney Robert Haida to secure a death sentence that could then serve as precedent for the others. The defense fought bitterly, filing motion after motion to suppress Fayne's confessions, claiming he had been denied a lawyer during interrogations and isolated for 24 days. They painted him as a product of a poisoned childhood, beaten by his alcoholic mother, possibly brain damaged from repeated head trauma and fetal alcohol exposure. Court psychologist Daniel Cuneo testified that Fayne's mind had been compromised from the beginning. He's had a repeated history of head trauma. He was choked until unconscious. He may have been born with fetal alcohol syndrome. Yet prosecutors dismiss this as a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to shield a man they described as a sadist who preyed on children and violated their bodies even after death. The first trial opened in July 1994, and it was Ari Hunt's mother, Desi Wiggum, who bore the brunt of its cruelty. She sat in the courtroom, forced to endure testimony that her son had been sodomized, his head crushed against a concrete wall, his small body discarded in weeds at Frank Holton State Park. She flinched as Fayne's own confession was read aloud. He had killed Ari because he wanted to hear the sound of a child's neck snapping. Wiggum later told reporters, "Everybody who knew Ari just fell in love." But the words could not blunt the imagery of what Fayne had done. After days of testimony, the jury returned with its verdict. Fayne was found guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of Ari Hunt. But when the time came to decide his punishment, the panel fractured. 11 jurors voted for death, 1 refused. The deadlock meant Fayne escaped execution. The families looked on in disbelief as the opportunity for capital punishment evaporated with a single dissenting voice. Judge James K. Donovan delivered the sentence on August 30th, 1994. Staring at Fayne, he declared, "This case was the most chilling I have ever dealt with. The violence perpetrated on that little boy, perhaps after he was dead, shows what this man is capable of is beyond the imagination of anybody in this courtroom." Then he passed down life without parole. "It means, Mr. Fayne, that you will die in the penitentiary." In court, Fayne offered a hollow apology. "Sorry is all I can say. I can't bring him back." But the words rang empty to the families who sat stone-faced, clutching photographs of the children whose lives he had obliterated. By 2001, after years of litigation and appeals, Fayne stood once more before a judge and entered a plea. He pleaded guilty to 4 murders: Latondra Dean, Fallon Flood, Glenda Jones, and Faith Davis, sparing families additional trials, but ensuring that he would never again see freedom. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors abandoned multiple death penalty hearings and consolidated sentencing. Fayne was sentenced to additional life terms, stacked upon his first, each one a permanent wall sealing him inside the penitentiary. When the final gavel fell, Fayne had avoided execution, but only barely. He was destined to live out his years caged, surrounded not by children but by the concrete walls of a prison that would be his tomb. For the families, it was not enough. They had prayed for death, begged for it, demanded it. Instead, they received a promise from the judge that Fayne would die in captivity, his name forever shackled to the horrors he had inflicted. But the damage was already done. Desi Wiggum had lost all 3 of her children to violence. Gloria Flood could still see her daughter's shy smile frozen in a school photograph. Mary Dean still burned with the wish to end Fayne's life with her own hands. And through it all, Fayne, once a boy beaten in Milwaukee, later a man who became the most notorious child killer in Metro East history, sat in chains, his fate sealed not by execution but by the slow passage of years behind bars. In the end, justice came not with the swiftness of the needle, but with the endless drag of time. Lorenzo Fayne will draw his final breath behind penitentiary walls, but the lives he extinguished echo louder than any sentence imposed upon him. The laughter of children silenced, the photographs clutched by grieving mothers, the memories carved into the marrow of East St. Louis. These are the true life sentences, endured not by Fayne, but by the families left in his wake.
Scared?
Families formed watch groups.
In the late 70s,
Paranoid?
Youngsters fingerprinted by local police departments.
and early 80s,
Families were very concerned.
Salt Lake City
Alonzo Daniel
was under the grip of fear.
vanished from his Salt Lake City home.
Little boys, Alonzo Daniels, Kim Peterson, Danny Davis,
The string of child disappearances began October 16th.
Troy Ward, Graham Cunningham began to vanish. 5 in all, without a trace. Police began to question Bishop, and without a stitch of emotion, Bishop methodically recalls how he killed the little boy. On March 19th, 1984,
This is Michael Rawson reporting live from the 3rd District Court in Salt Lake City. It is death for Arthur Gary Bishop.
Bishop is sentenced to die of lethal injection.
Dad, I'm glad you caught me, because I couldn't stop, and I would go do it again if I had the chance.
From 1979 to 1983, 5 boys were taken, violated, and killed by the same man. Each one was targeted in broad daylight and removed so cleanly that no one realized what was happening until it was already over. Their lives ended in different ways, but every one of those deaths led back to the same calculated predator who had learned exactly how far he could go without being stopped. It started with a scream that no one heard in time. A mother's voice cut through the air outside a Salt Lake City apartment complex as she called for her 4-year-old son. She ran across the courtyard where he had been playing just minutes earlier. Close enough to be safe and close enough that nothing should have gone wrong. But somehow he was gone. All that was left was confusion, panic, and the beginning of a search that would never bring him back. At that exact moment, a man walked past her carrying a cardboard box under his arm. He moved calmly through the chaos with the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't draw attention. His expression was controlled, his pace steady, and he even offered a polite nod as he passed by the very woman who was just starting to realize something was wrong. Inside that box was her son, already silenced and already beyond help, now part of something much bigger than anyone there could understand. No one stopped him, because no one knew what was inside that box. No one stopped him because no one knew Arthur Bishop had just turned a little boy's laughter into silence forever. And this was only the first time. He'd do it again to 4 others. Salt Lake City in the late 1970s felt like the safest place on earth. Clean streets ran between rows of modest homes where Mormon families raised their children on faith, bicycles, and unlocked doors. Kids vanished for hours and nobody panicked. Strangers felt like neighbors. But beneath that postcard perfection, something evil was learning how to smile. Arthur Bishop was born on September 9, 1952, in the small town of Hinckley, Utah. He was the 5th of 9 children. The family was not wealthy, but they had what they needed. His mother stayed at home and took care of the household. His father worked the railroad and farmed 40 acres, but spoke so little that young Art mistook silence for rejection and carried the ache like a tumor. He was a sensitive, passive boy, a loner who stood on the edge of games rather than leading them. He felt empathy when he saw animals or other children suffer. He cried during the final scene of Bonnie and Clyde, trembling as the bullets tore into the outlaws. Yet something darker was already stirring. At 14, he became fixated on a 7-year-old boy at the local swimming hole. He touched the child once. The boy pushed him away. In that moment, a fleeting, horrifying thought crossed Art's mind. The only way to without consequence would be to kill him first. He recoiled from the idea and fled home, but the seed had been planted. High school turned him into an easy target. Overweight, thick glasses, mild stutter. The other boys tore into him daily, yet he clawed his way to 3rd in a class of 103, earned his Eagle Scout Award, and collected church honors like trophies. In 1970, he fled to the Philippines on a 2-year Mormon mission, praying the work of God would remove the evil desires out of him forever. For a while it did. He avoided looking at unclothed boys who ran freely through the islands. He threw himself into missionary labor. Then one day a boy casually walked naked into the room where Art sat. The hunger detonated like a bomb. That night, alone in the shower, he broke pleasuring himself to his fantasies. Devastated, he swallowed an entire bottle of aspirin, hoping it would take him out of his misery. He vomited it up and survived. He told the mission president about his struggles with lust, but left out the age and gender it was towards. He asked to go home because of the temptation, but instead was encouraged to stick it out and was moved him to a new area. Art finished his mission, but the shame never left. He had broken his covenant with God, and every cycle of secret indulgence and desperate repentance only fed the monster growing inside him. Back in Utah, he built the perfect mask. Bookkeeper by day, big brother volunteer by choice. Parents handed him their sons with grateful smiles. The boys adored him. No one noticed the hunger sharpening its teeth behind that helpful, trustworthy face. By 1978, he had embezzled money, skipped probation, changed his name to Roger Downs, and moved into a modest bungalow at 581 East 2100 South. He was now a ghost with a new identity, a new address, and no intention of ever going to prison. The hunger had waited long enough. Now it was ready to be unleashed. On October 17, 1979, Bishop returned to his apartment and saw 4-year-old Alonzo Daniels outside playing near the building, close enough to home that no one would have expected anything to go wrong. It was an ordinary scene, a child in a familiar space, within reach of safety. And that's what made it so easy for him to approach without raising concern. He spoke to the boy calmly, inviting him inside to play with toys, using the same tone and approach he had used before to gain trust. There was no force, no urgency, and nothing about the interaction that would have made it appear unusual to anyone watching. Alonzo followed him inside without hesitation. Once the door closed, the situation changed in a way that could not be undone. Bishop acted on the sick and deviant impulses he'd been battling, but this time the child reacted in a way that forced an immediate decision. Alonzo began to cry, calling for his mom, and in that moment Bishop understood exactly what would happen if the child left and told someone what he did. The fear of being exposed became overwhelming, but instead of stopping, he did the unthinkable. He picked up a hammer and struck Alonzo in the head multiple times, ending his life to remove the risk of getting caught. He later described that moment with a level of awareness that dismissed any claim of him acting impulsively. He said that when he raised the hammer, his arm hesitated, and something inside him screamed, "No!" But he followed through anyway. He said that when it was over, he felt as if something had been pulled out of him, gesturing toward his chest as he described it, as though whatever resisted before was no longer there. His first kill didn't stop him, it changed him. What followed was not panic in the way someone might expect. He called his workplace and told them he would not be returning, creating space for himself to deal with what he had done without interruption. He placed the child's body into a box and carried it out of the apartment in broad daylight, walking past the same courtyard where the child had been playing minutes earlier. As he moved toward his car, he could hear Alonzo's mother outside, her voice growing louder and more frantic as she called his name and began searching. He later admitted hearing her, understanding exactly what she was experiencing in that moment, but ignoring it. He continued walking, carrying the box to his car as if nothing had happened. He drove south toward the Cedar Fort area, a remote stretch outside Salt Lake City, and buried the body in a location where he believed it would never be found. Then he left the area and returned to his life. But that night, he claimed the guilt began to surface. He later said he could hear the mother's voice in his mind, calling out, repeating over and over what he did. He admitted, "I had an urgent feeling of impending disaster. I dreamed of that day over and over, and described being unable to sleep, afraid to be alone and afraid of the dark. The reality of what he did felt as though the weight of it might break him. Somehow, he learned to suppress it. He moved out of the apartment because he could not stand being there anymore, putting distance between himself and the place where it had happened. Over time, the nightmares became less frequent. The intensity of the fear began to fade, and the overwhelming sense of panic gave way to something quieter. He returned to routine, returned to normal interactions, and continued living in a way that suggested nothing had changed. But something had changed in a way that would not reverse. Because the most important part was not what he felt immediately after. It was what happened when those feelings went away. He had crossed the line into depravity, done something irreversible, and after the fear faded, he was still there, still functioning, and still free. There had been no interruption, no immediate consequence, and no one had stopped him. That realization settled into him in a way that removed something critical. Because now he knew he could submit to his impulse to kill, and it became an urge he couldn't break free from. Salt Lake City had already tasted blood once, but the city still slept soundly. More than a year had crawled by since Arthur Gary Bishop slaughtered 5-year-old Alonzo Daniels and buried the boy in a shallow desert grave. On the surface, Bishop had rebuilt the flawless mask of a normal life well enough to fool everyone around him. Beneath that mask, nothing had healed. The same sick compulsions still clawed at him day and night, only now they were far more dangerous because he carried something new and lethal in his chest. The cold knowledge that he could murder a child and keep walking around like nothing had happened. During that long year, he had grown dangerously close to a boy named Jess. Bishop showered Jess with attention, gifts, and outings, carefully weaving a web of dependency and control. He later admitted he needed the boy in a way that went way beyond companionship. Jess became his emotional anchor, the only thing keeping the loneliness and chaos from swallowing him whole. That attachment was never stable or healthy. It created a constant grinding pressure that made Bishop more unpredictable with every passing week. The boy both saved him and dragged him deeper into the same nightmare he had never truly escaped. It was through Jess that Bishop first met 13-year-old Kim Peterson. From the very first moment, Kim felt different. He was outgoing, confident, and easy to talk to. The interaction required almost no effort, and Bishop sensed immediately that this boy would not react the same way the others had. The barrier that should have been there simply wasn't. The hunger sharpened. The next day, Bishop contacted Kim and arranged to meet, using a simple, believable excuse tied to a pair of roller skates the boy had mentioned. When they came together, Bishop smoothly shifted the plan without raising alarm. He offered money in exchange for going hunting, guiding the teenager into a remote, empty stretch of desert where no one else would ever see or hear them. Once they were completely alone, Bishop followed the same twisted script he had used before. He spun a story about being blackmailed and needing explicit photographs as payment, framing the whole thing as a cold, transactional necessity rather than a threat. Kim hesitated at first, uneasy and resistant. Bishop kept pressing, offering more money and calm reassurance until the boy's resistance finally cracked and he agreed. Up to that point, everything remained controlled, predictable, and safely inside the boundaries Bishop had drawn. But as they began walking back toward the car, Kim said something that shattered the illusion of control. He made it clear he expected more money in the future and implied the situation would not end here. The threat of exposure hung in the dry desert air like a noose. That single statement flipped a switch inside Bishop. There was no panic this time, only a cold, calculated decision. He later described the exact thought that raced through his mind. "I've already killed. Will I be damned any more for 2 lives?" The act that had once felt unthinkable had become something he could weigh, justify, and carry out without hesitation. The last barrier inside him had been burned away. As Kim turned and started walking away, Bishop pulled out the gun and shot him in the back. The boy dropped instantly. The kill was direct, efficient, and ice cold. No internal screaming, no last-second resistance. Just the calm removal of a problem. Kim Peterson died within seconds, and Bishop stood alone in the silence once again. This time the aftermath was different. He moved through the desert disoriented but still functional, quickly realizing he had not brought the tools he needed to finish the job. He drove back into the city, retrieved a shovel, and returned to the remote spot like a man running a grim errand. He buried the body with far more control and deliberation than he had shown with Alonzo. Only afterward did the reaction hit. He became violently ill, vomiting repeatedly as waves of self-hatred crashed over him. At one point he pressed the barrel of the gun into his own mouth, ready to end it all, but once again he lacked the courage to pull the trigger. The familiar cycle returned, but it had grown weaker and more hollow. Emotional emptiness swallowed him. Nightmares clawed at his sleep. He felt strangely detached from the murder, as if he had not been fully present during the act. The guilt was real. The physical sickness was real. The psychological damage was real. But none of it mattered, and he continued to indulge in evil. Bishop went back to his ordinary life, continued his controlling relationship with Jess, and let the same dark behaviors keep growing unchecked. Arthur decided he was no longer going to fight against his urges. He knew he was evil and embraced it. Salt Lake City had already swallowed 2 boys, but the city was still unaware. By October 20th, 1981, Arthur Gary Bishop was no longer killing in blind panic or crushing fear. He had crossed that line twice and kept breathing, kept smiling, kept walking among the living without consequence. The terror of being caught still whispered in the back of his skull, but it no longer ruled him. Something colder and far more dangerous had taken its place. He had learned to trust the patterns that worked. He no longer waited for opportunity. He hunted for it. That day, he was already hunting. He returned home restless, gnawed by the same savage impulses that had been sharpening inside him for years. The cheap satisfactions he had been feeding on were no longer enough. He needed something immediate, something real. He cruised past the houses of boys he already knew, hoping one would be outside and alone, hoping to manufacture another controllable situation. When that failed, he kept driving, drifting through neighborhoods with no clear plan, but one clear, burning intention. The restlessness did not fade. It grew teeth and claws, pushing him forward until he found what he was looking for. He found it inside a grocery store. 4-year-old Danny Davis stood in the toy aisle, small, distracted, and dangerously alone for just long enough. Bishop moved in close, sat down as if he were another shopper, and began watching the child like a predator studying prey. He tested the air, waiting to see if any adult would notice or interfere. When the people nearby drifted away, the opening appeared. Bishop spoke to the boy first in a casual voice, then more firmly, promising better toys if he would just follow him outside. When Danny hesitated, Bishop leaned in, spoke with quiet authority, then turned and started walking away, knowing from experience that the child would trail after him, and Danny did. Bishop kept his distance as they left the store, careful not to draw eyes, letting the moment look perfectly ordinary. Once they reached the shadowed edge of the parking lot, he scooped the tiny boy up and carried him swiftly across a field and straight into his house. There was no struggle, no scream, no interruption. The entire abduction unfolded in a matter of minutes. By the time anyone realized Danny Davis was missing, he had already vanished into Bishop's private hell. Inside the house, Bishop paused. He later admitted the child was younger than his usual target, and for one brief flicker he considered sending the boy back. That flicker died almost instantly. He let Danny play with toys while he prepared himself, describing the sensation to kill as strangely detached, as though he were watching another man move through the motions. What had once demanded agonizing hesitation and screaming internal conflict now required almost none. The monster had grown comfortable. Davis became bored and started to cry. Concerned about the noise, Bishop put his hand over the boy's nose and mouth until he stopped breathing. Then the phone rang. It was Paul, asking if he and another boy could come over to watch a movie. Bishop answered in a perfectly calm voice and told them to come ahead. That interruption didn't derail what he had already begun. He concealed the horror just enough to keep control, letting the two boys arrive, interact with him, and leave again without ever sensing the fresh nightmare hidden only feet away. The ice-cold composure required to switch between those realities without cracking revealed exactly how far Bishop had already fallen. Later, when the house was empty again, he returned to finish what he had started. He placed Danny's small body into a box and drove it out toward the lonely cedar fort area where he had already planted the others. While he was digging, two men in a truck rolled up close enough to see everything, close enough to end him. Instead of panicking, Bishop walked straight up to them, looked them in the eye, and casually explained that he was burying a dead dog. They bought the lie without question and drove away. The moment passed, and just like before, he survived it. The aftermath followed the familiar script, but the emotional weight was already rotting away. He watched Danny's face appear on television, watched the frantic search efforts, and felt the same wave of nausea and self-loathing he had felt after the previous killings. Yet something new had crept in. He found himself strangely drawn to the investigation, following every detail while knowing how close the noose had come. That tension did not repel him. It excited him. And at some point, the shift became permanent. He later admitted that after Danny, the act itself began to carry a new, darker flavor. The memory no longer haunted him only with guilt. It started to pull him back, to linger in his mind like a drug. He described wanting the next time to feel sharper, more defined, more lasting, as if the killing itself needed to burn deeper and stay with him longer. That was when it stopped being mere reaction and became something he was beginning to chase. By June 22, 1983, Arthur Gary Bishop was no longer reacting to moments that spiraled out of control. He had evolved into something far more calculated and depraved. He was now deliberately building environments where total control was the only goal, shaping his surroundings to serve the hunger instead of waiting for opportunity to stumble into his lap. In the basement of his home, he had constructed a private chamber he coldly called the Grow Room. What began as a space to cultivate marijuana had mutated into something far darker, an isolated, soundproofed dungeon hidden from the world. That shift made him infinitely more dangerous. On that warm June day, he was not wandering aimlessly or cruising stores the way he once had. He moved through the streets with cold, predatory intent. He spotted 6-year-old Troy Ward standing alone on a corner and initiated contact in the most disarming way possible. Bishop asked the little boy for directions, pretending he was lost and needed help finding Liberty Park. The interaction felt completely harmless, almost friendly. Troy responded politely, engaged with the nice man. And Bishop used that opening to gently extend the conversation until the child agreed to come along. There was no visible pressure, no urgency, just a smooth, practiced manipulation that lured the boy away from safety. He took him straight back to the house. Inside, the nightmare Bishop had engineered came to life. He led Troy down into the basement and asked if he wanted to play a game, something designed to lower the child's guard and prevent immediate terror. Then he restrained the 6-year-old with handcuffs, securing him to fixed points in the room with deliberate, practiced efficiency. He violated the boy. Then, Troy began crying. To avoid anyone from hearing, Bishop hit him with a rubber mallet until he was silent. He left the house, picked Jess up, and drove him home as if nothing had happened. Then he returned to the basement. That sequence revealed how completely detached and compartmentalized Bishop had become. He could step from the fresh horror of murder into casual conversation, speak normally, act like a helpful adult, and then calmly walk back downstairs to finish what he had started, all without cracking. Afterward, he transported the small body up Big Cottonwood Canyon and dumped it into the creek, using the same disposal method he had perfected on the previous victims. The pattern was now a ritual, and unfortunately it would continue once more. By July 14, 1983, Arthur Gary Bishop was losing control of the one thing that had kept him grounded. Jess was pulling away, setting limits, and no longer willing to be alone with him. That shift hit him hard because Jess wasn't just a friend, he was the center of his life. Bishop later admitted that losing him felt like losing everything, and without that connection, there was nothing left to stabilize him. The control he thought he had built was slipping, and he could feel it happening. Instead of backing off, he looked for a way to regain it. He chose Graham Cunningham, his fifth and final victim. Graham had been around before, had stayed over, and had already been close enough for Bishop to test boundaries in smaller ways that never surfaced but never went away. When Jess insisted Graham come on the California trip, Bishop saw the opportunity immediately. The night before they were supposed to leave, he called Graham and offered him marijuana to sell for money, something simple and believable. When Graham got into the car, there was nothing to suggest what was about to happen. Bishop took him back to his house, pretended to set up a job, then shifted into the same story he had used before, about being blackmailed and needing him to pose for photographs. Graham hesitated, but Bishop kept pushing. He offered him more money and didn't give him space to fully back out. Eventually, Graham agreed. Not because he trusted him, but because the situation had been shaped in a way that leaving felt harder than staying. Everything that followed stayed under Bishop's control until Graham stood up and started getting dressed. That moment mattered because it meant the interaction was ending and Bishop was about to lose control of him. Arthur became paranoid that Graham would tell on him. He later said, "I loved him at this point. I thought, you're mine." Graham was sitting on the bed, focused on leaving, when Bishop picked up a hammer and struck him twice. Then, Arthur took him to the bathroom, filled up the tub, and drowned him. Arthur claims that after he killed Graham, he became physically sick, overwhelmed by what he had just done. He later called it the hardest one, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. But even with that reaction, he didn't stop. He cleaned himself up, left the house, and went to see Jess like nothing had happened. He gave him money for the trip, sat with him, talked normally, knowing exactly what he had just done hours earlier. He admitted later, "I knew I was going to miss Graham as a person." Then he went back and finished it. He drove up Big Cottonwood Canyon, the same place he had used before, and put Graham in the creek the same way he had done with Troy Ward. Same location, same method, same attempt to erase it, but this time it didn't feel the same. He later said he felt emptier than he ever had, like whatever he had been chasing wasn't there anymore. There was no relief, no control, just nothing. And this time it didn't stay buried. The next morning, Jess called and said Graham was missing. Bishop acted like it surprised him, but the pressure was already building. Jess started questioning Arthur, the boys he had known, the way they disappeared, and even without saying it directly, the suspicion was there. When they got back, Graham's mother asked him when he last saw her son, and Arthur's answer placed him right at the center of it. She walked into another room and called the police. Within minutes, everything he had been holding together started to collapse. There was no escape, no time for things to settle, no way to return to normal like he had before. His fear of being caught for his heinous acts was about to become a reality. The police advised Arthur over the phone that he needs to come to the department and speak with them. He didn't argue. He went. They brought Arthur Gary Bishop into the interview room at the Metropolitan Hall of Justice in Salt Lake City and sat him down at 3:56 in the afternoon, already knowing more about him than he realized. Detectives had been working around him for hours, separating him from John, talking to witnesses, and quietly building a picture that didn't match the version he was trying to present. At first, the conversation didn't feel like an interrogation. Detective Steve Smith later said, "At first, we just bullshitted for about an hour. We talked about his job. We just talked stuff. But underneath that casual tone, they were watching him closely. They already knew he was lying, and they were waiting for the moment it would break." While Bishop sat there trying to stay ahead of it, everything around him was collapsing. Jess had already started talking. Detective Bell would later say, "He told us about the pictures and the other boys. I knew I had Bishop." And then John mentioned Kim Peterson. That changed everything. Smith recalled the moment clearly, saying, "It was at that point I became pretty sure he'd killed them. Here we had the last guy to see Kim Peterson and the last guy to see Graham. Now we believed they were both dead. What had started as a missing persons case was turning into something else entirely, and Bishop was sitting right in the middle of it. When they brought him back in, he denied everything. For nearly an hour, he insisted he didn't know where Graham was, said he hadn't seen him, and rejected anything that tied him to the disappearance. He even pushed back on parts of the questioning, telling detectives, "That's disgusting," when they confronted him about his behavior. He tried to hold that line, but it wasn't strong enough. Detective Bell started pressing harder, bringing up the warrant for jumping probation, the theft cases tied to different names, and the fact that they knew who he really was. Then Bell shifted tactics. He told Bishop what Jess had said. "You know what John tells me?" Bell said. "He thinks you're a weirdo. I tell him you're going to the Utah State Prison and I think he's going to cry. Do you know what he does? He says that's the biggest relief he's had. He's been trying to figure out for 2 years how to get away from you." That hit. Bishop tried to hold on, saying he was being misunderstood, but Bell didn't let it go. "There's going to be a whole lot of other people wanting to misunderstand you." An imperious Detective Bell tells Bishop, "First will be the judges who've signed warrants for his arrest. But you know who's really going to love you? The people out in Draper Penitentiary. They're going to find out all of this. They're going to find out that you go around with little boys. They're going to find out that you sleep with little boys, and do you know what they do? They say, 'We may be convicts, we may be people that nobody else likes, but one thing we have in common with all humanity is that we hate child predators,'" the detective said. "You know, it was all I could do not to get up and knock you right on your ass when you sit there and got all choked up about how wonderful John was." Bell later said Bishop seemed more afraid of going to prison than admitting to murder, and you can see it in what he started saying. He paced the room, restless, agitated, unable to sit still. Detective Bell wrote that Bishop reminded him of a caged animal in a zoo. At one point he stopped and asked, "How long would it take the state to kill me if I did something really bad? I want to be electrocuted." Bell told him, "We don't electrocute in Utah, but something could be arranged." That's when Bell knew. "I knew then that Graham was dead." Bishop's thinking had already shifted past denial. He wasn't asking if he would be punished. He was asking how fast it would happen. Detective Bell urged him to say where Graham was, even if that was all he could give, telling him it would at least help the boy's parents. Bishop responded, "There is no God. God wouldn't let things happen that have happened." Then he asked to go back to his house, saying he wanted to show them something. Before they left, he made a phone call to John's mother, Irene, telling her, "You'll hate me when you find out what I've done." When they got to the house, it was dark and closed up, the air heavy from being shut for days. Bishop led them inside, went to a hallway drawer, and pulled out a blue carton filled with Polaroids, handing them to Bell. Then, without saying anything, he opened a locked gray metal box. It was filled with photographs. Bell's notes captured his reaction. "Gave me photos. 80-100. Weird." But when counted, there were more than 300 Polaroid photographs and 125 additional images cut from magazines. The box also contained homemade videotapes, films, and books titled Sex Without Shame, Show Me, The Paper Trip, and How to Disappear and Live Free. Bishop then took detectives into his room and showed them a white wedding album filled with more pictures. Everything he had been hiding was now in front of them. They left the house and drove back to the station in silence. Detective Bell intentionally drove past the Cunningham home on 300 East. Bishop did not react. Back in the interrogation room, Bell asked again where Graham was. Bishop said, "You'll hate me when I tell you." Bell responded, "I won't." Bishop said, "I'll make you famous." Bell answered, "I don't want to be famous. I just want to find Graham." Bishop replied, "It doesn't matter anymore." Bell came back immediately. It matters to his parents. Bishop then said, I killed him. The confession began at 6:50 in the evening and lasted less than an hour at first, focused on Graham. But Detective Bell noticed Bishop using the word they when referring to what had happened and asked if there was more. Bishop said, Yes, Troy Ward. I kidnapped and killed. Detective Smith later said, I had figured Graham and maybe Kim, but nobody else. We just fell over backwards. Then Bishop continued. He spoke about Kim Peterson, saying, He's mine. I can show you where his body's buried. Then Alonzo. Bell stopped him and asked, How many others are we talking about? What about Danny Davis? Bishop answered, Danny Davis I did. By that point, he had named them all. After that he said, I've done a wrong to society here. I've killed their children. There's no way that I can bring them back. There's no way that I can really comfort their parents. He admitted he had nightmares and that he was afraid. When they stood him up to take him to jail, he hesitated and said, I'm not going. You should just kill me. You don't know all of the things I've done. But at that point they did. Arthur Gary Bishop was booked into custody and formally charged with 5 counts of aggravated murder, 1 for each boy he had taken. Alonzo Daniels, Danny Davis, Kim Peterson, Troy Ward, and Graham Cunningham. These were not accusations built on theory or assumption. He had already confessed. He had already shown them where to look. There was nothing left to question and nothing left to defend. Arthur Gary Bishop did not take his case to trial in the traditional sense. After confessing to the killings, he entered guilty pleas to 5 counts of aggravated murder, each tied to one of the victims: Alonzo Daniels, Danny Davis, Kim Peterson, Troy Ward, and Graham Cunningham. With those pleas, the case moved directly into the sentencing phase, eliminating the need for a jury to determine guilt. During proceedings, Bishop did not attempt to distance himself from what he had done. Instead, he acknowledged responsibility and made it clear that he believed the appropriate punishment was death. In statements reported at the time, he indicated that he did not want to spend the rest of his life in prison and accepted the consequences of his actions without resistance. The court sentenced him to death. In the period leading up to his execution, Bishop made statements that were widely reported, expressing both acknowledgement of his crimes and a desire that others would not follow the same path. In one of his more notable remarks, he stated that he hoped his case might serve as a warning, saying in substance that he wanted people to understand how his behavior escalated before it reached the point of no return. Arthur Gary Bishop was executed by lethal injection on June 10, 1988, at the Utah State Prison. He chose execution by lethal injection. His death marked the end of a case that had begun with the disappearance of a single child in 1979, and ultimately revealed a pattern of 5 murders from one of the worst predators America has ever seen. The case closed with his execution, but the impact did not.
Exactly what a serial killer looks like. I'm exactly what it looks like. I agree. And I killed all 3 of them. I didn't just go out and start killing. Started asking other. See, things kept progressing. I kept getting away with all these crimes. Well, I was going to try to do a little bit more. I was enjoying what I was doing. You know, I mean, hey, great. I could do anything I want. Anything I wanted to kill. I just became obsessed with it at that point. I'm going to get that little to keep them and use them for as long as I wanted. I use them as.
There are very few people as wicked as Westley Allan Dodd. He violated hundreds of children for his own deviant pleasure, then took the lives of 3. He planned to eliminate many more, had he not been caught while attempting to abduct a 4th child. But what makes this case even more disturbing isn't just what he did, it's what he wrote. Westley Dodd drafted a 3-page contract, pledging his soul to Satan in exchange for the chance to continue ending children's lives without being caught.
Satan, I dedicate these children's lives to you. May they serve your will in darkness.
If you don't believe Satan exists, then I'd like you to ponder this question. How does someone commit such atrocities, especially when Dodd himself denied being victimized as a child and claims to have had a normal upbringing? This is the story of Westley Allan Dodd, one of the most evil human beings to have ever lived. The heat pressed down on Labor Day, September 4, 1989, drawing families to parks across Vancouver, Washington. For most, It was a day of barbecues, laughter, and tired drives home. For Westley Allan Dodd, 28, it was the day his long-planned nightmare became real. Dodd had been consumed by his urges for days. He barely slept, tormented by fantasies he recorded in his diary and fed through, pleasuring himself. Over the weekend, he scouted David Douglas Park, a mile from his apartment, walking the trails, noting secluded spots near playgrounds and paths where children played. He was planning his first kill. He prepared simple tools, a 6-inch fish fillet knife strapped to his calf with an ace bandage and long shoelaces for binding. He stalked boys and girls in the park and nearby stores, frustrated each time adults or groups interfered. By Monday afternoon, he returned, determined not to leave empty-handed. He reasoned that vanishing children would draw less immediate attention than bodies left behind, preserving the park as future hunting ground. Around 4 in the afternoon, 11-year-old Cole Neer and his 10-year-old brother Billy rode their BMX bikes through the park on a shortcut home after collecting lost golf balls. Dodd stepped onto the dirt trail, blocking their path. "Get off your bikes," he ordered. Puzzled but obedient, they complied. He told them to follow him, bringing the bikes to avoid drawing attention. They walked deeper into the woods. He bound their wrists together with shoelaces and led them off-trail into thick brush. There he forced them to stand back to back, then demanded one let him pull down his... After hesitation and fear, he violated each one. They pleaded to go home, promising not to tell. Dodd briefly tried to assault one further but stopped after failing to get a... He unbound them to reposition, then drew the knife. The boys begged him not to kill them. He drove the knife into Billy's stomach. Billy doubled over and tried to run. Dodd turned and stabbed Cole multiple times in the chest and side. Cole collapsed and died quickly. Dodd chased Billy, caught him, and ignored Billy, apologizing and begging for his life. Dodd stabbed Billy again in the side and shoulder. Billy fell. Dodd left both boys in the woods, Cole fully exposed and lifeless, Billy sprawled and bleeding, and walked out calmly, blending into the Labor Day crowd. He drove away, later disposing of the knife at work. The entire attack lasted about 20 minutes. The next day, Dodd returned to his job at Pack Paper as if nothing happened. At around 6:45 p.m. on Labor Day, September 4, 1989, 17-year-old Danny Miller walked a dirt bike trail shortcut through David Douglas Park in Vancouver, Washington. After his McDonald's shift, he spotted what appeared to be a drunk in a ditch, then realized it was a young boy about 10 years old, lying in a pool of blood, barely breathing with severe stab wounds to his chest and abdomen. Miller ran to a nearby convenience store and called 911. Paramedics and Vancouver police arrived quickly and recognized it as no accident. The boy, later identified as 10-year-old Billy Neer, was airlifted by life flight to Emmanuel Hospital in Portland, but died en route at 7:37 p.m. He was initially listed as Junior Doe. Meanwhile, Claire Neer reported his sons, 11-year-old Cole and 10-year-old Billy, missing after they failed to return home from collecting golf balls. Detective Jeff Sunby, leading the stabbing investigation, connected the dots when photos matched the dead boy to one of the missing brothers. A large overnight search involving police, firefighters, and volunteers began. Cole's body was found in thick brush near 2 abandoned BMX bikes about 25 yards away. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen, with defensive wounds showing he fought back. Both boys had been attacked in the same secluded area between 6:15 and 6:45 p.m. Police informed Claire Neer of the devastating news. Evidence, including Cole's pants pulled down, indicated a sexual predator was responsible. The community reeled at the realization 2 young brothers on bikes had crossed paths with pure evil in a place that should have been safe. The murders of Billy and Cole Neer shocked Vancouver and triggered an intense police investigation. On September 5th, detectives questioned Danny Miller, the teenager who discovered Billy wounded and called authorities. Because he was the only person known to have been at the scene, investigators scrutinized him for nearly 9 weeks, interviewing him repeatedly and speaking with his family, friends, and co-workers. Ultimately, no evidence linked Miller to the crime, and he was cleared. Detectives then turned their attention to the park itself. Teams searched David Douglas Park using metal detectors and canvassed the surrounding McLaughlin Heights neighborhood for information. A rusted knife found during the search was quickly ruled out as the murder weapon. Police also examined the Neer family background to rule out any internal connection. but nothing suggested the killer knew the family. Witnesses reported suspicious men in the park, leading to composite sketches that generated more than 100 tips. Investigators pursued each lead, checking vehicles, addresses, and known offenders, but none produced a viable suspect. The FBI also assisted by developing a behavioral profile suggesting the killer was likely a local man familiar with the park. Despite the widespread search, the investigation produced no immediate breakthrough, and the case remained unresolved in its early stages. After Labor Day 1989, the shadows in Westley Allan Dodd's duplex grew heavier. While Vancouver detectives pursued fruitless leads across empty trails, Dodd sat alone beneath a single dim bulb in air thick with his sweat and secrets. The memories of Cole's wide, vacant eyes and Billy's final, tearful apologies remained vivid, their metallic taste lingering on his tongue. He opened his diary and established a new rule: no more rushed killings in public spaces. The next victim would suffer slowly, hours or even days if possible. He intended to savor every flinch, every plea, every small body yielding beneath his hands, then conceal the remains so thoroughly that the world would forget the child had ever existed. He spread maps across the scarred table and circled parks in Vancouver and playgrounds in Portland, places where children still played without suspicion. With careful pencil strokes, he traced escape routes, assessed sightlines, and evaluated the likelihood of finding a child alone. Reconnaissance missions would begin soon. Patience had become his sharpest tool. Newspapers fueled his growing obsession. He read every article twice, clipped them out like valuable keepsakes, and added them to his journal alongside his own private notes. The public reports never included details about Cole's state of undress, or any sexual aspects the police may have overlooked or chosen not to disclose. That lack of information gave him a sense of protection. His journal entries became longer and more elaborate over time. They described imagined, repeated harms, mental images of situations before and after, and careful efforts to remove any potential evidence. He wrote about intending to use protection during any contact, regardless of the victim's condition, and forcing certain interactions. In his mind, the act of ending a life, the knife, the final response, provided a more intense thrill than anything leading up to it. One particular fantasy kept recurring: a blindfolded boy held close, his small frame against him, with a knife positioned nearby. He imagined prolonging that tense moment before any action, then carrying it out. Putting these thoughts into words affected him deeply. He reflected on the Near brothers' case in the Ferns, and eventually was able to rest. On September 7th, a newspaper composite sketch hit too close. Accurate eyes and mustache. Fear gripped him. He stayed inside mostly, pulling a hat low when he had to go out, breath short until the panic faded. One night, sheriff's cars rolled into his driveway. Heart racing, Dodd peeked through the curtains, sure they were there for him. But the deputies talked briefly with his landlady about an unrelated tenant issue and left. Relief hit hard and fast. By September 12th, updated sketches on the news looked nothing like him. The knot in his stomach eased. He could breathe again. He steered clear of David Douglas Park. One child might spot him, but the urge never faded. He kept mapping spots and listing ways to end a life like options on a list. Quick with a blade, quiet with pressure, controlled another way. He drew detailed plans for restraints labeled for holding kids longer. Pages filled with anatomical sketches and notes on prolonged captivity, using pills to calm resistance and careful methods to avoid obvious signs. He whispered dark promises to whatever listened, trading everything for an easy target aged 6 to 10. September closed in a blur of intense writing and growing frustration. No new opportunity came. The plans only grew sharper and more twisted. Something far worse was building, ready to erupt in October and scar the Pacific Northwest for years. Westley Allan Dodd restrained himself for weeks after killing the Near brothers, prioritizing evasion over impulse. Long work hours helped suppress his urges. By October 27th, the compulsion returned strongly. In his diary, he planned to abduct a boy the next day during his Saturday drive home, giving himself from 4 in the afternoon Saturday until Sunday night to have his way with a child, end his life for photos and post-mortem experiments, then dispose of the body before Monday work. He debated between quickly sacrificing a toddler or prolonged pain of an older boy, including forcing the child to participate in procedures before a hanging death. Writing these fantasies aroused him intensely. On Saturday, no suitable target appeared during his drive. That evening he went to Oaks Park in Portland, attracted by the crowds and children near the rides. He approached an 8-year-old boy by the spider ride and tried to lure him away with a promise of something interesting, but an adult intervened, forcing Dodd to flee in frustration. On Sunday, October 29th, Dodd purchased Polaroid film in the morning and returned to Richmond School's playground by 11:30. He observed several boys, then focused on a blonde 4-year-old playing alone on a concrete volcano-shaped mound. Dodd approached, greeted him warmly, and asked if he wanted to have fun and make money. After a hesitant refusal, Dodd extended his hand, and the trusting child took it. They walked hand in hand out of sight of others. Dodd told the boy they were going to his car. When the child resisted the idea of money or leaving, Dodd lifted him face to face, mentioned asking his dad for permission, and placed him in the yellow 1974 Ford Pinto station wagon. As they drove away, the boy, named Lee and 4 years old, protested that he lived the other direction. Dodd calmly explained they were going to his house to play games, promised not to hurt him if he obeyed, and instructed him to stay quiet because the landlady disliked children. During the short drive to Vancouver, Lee cried twice about his brother missing him. Each time, Dodd held the small hand and reassured him that everything would be fine, and they would have fun. At 1:30 in the afternoon, they arrived at the empty apartment. Both the landlady and other tenant were absent. Dodd set Lee down after lifting him from the car. The boy said he could walk. In complete trust, 4-year-old Lee followed Westley Allan Dodd through the door into the shadowed rooms inside. On October 29, 1989, around 1:30 in the afternoon, Robert E. Seeley called 911 after his 4-year-old son, Lee Joseph E. Seeley, vanished from the Richmond School playground in southeast Portland. Lee had gone there with his 9-year-old brother Justin and a friend, but only Justin returned home crying. Justin last saw Lee around 1 in the afternoon, on a concrete volcano mound, talking to a white man, 38 years old, 5'10". Thin, short brown hair, mustache, stubble, blue baseball cap with red lettering, blue jeans, and blue t-shirt. Justin warned Lee about strangers, then returned to playing. Minutes later, both were gone. Portland police responded quickly. Bloodhounds tracked Lee's scent to the curb at SE 41st and Sherman, then to Kino's grocery store at 39th and Division, where clerks saw him alone after 1, but both trails ended abruptly, indicating he entered a vehicle. A large search involving officers, volunteers, and flyers covered multiple blocks, but no trace emerged. Fears grew that a 4-year-old could not survive the cold night outside. Parental abduction was briefly considered, but ruled out when Lee's mother was located and had no involvement. By Monday evening, October 30th, homicide detective C.W. Jensen took over the case. Interviews with Justin and his friends raised inconsistencies and deepened concern. Justin saw Lee walk off alone or disappear after talking to the man, and witnesses recalled a pickup truck with a man and dog nearby. As leads dried up, Jensen feared the worst. Lee was already dead. Unbeknownst to searchers, the boy was being held across the river in Vancouver by Westley Allan Dodd. In the hours and days after Lee Iselli's disappearance from the Richmond School playground on October 29, 1989, the 4-year-old endured a tragic ordeal inside a quiet apartment in Vancouver, Washington. As later detailed in the perpetrator's private writings, Westley Allan Dodd brought Lee inside around 1:30 in the afternoon. He took Polaroid photographs of the boy and showed him an album containing inappropriate images of other children. Lee appeared curious but did not fully understand. Dodd instructed Lee to remove his clothing. After some hesitation and gentle encouragement, the boy complied. Dodd briefly used ropes to secure Lee's wrists and ankles to the bed for another photograph, then removed the restraints. Over the next hour, Dodd committed grotesque acts against the child. Afterward, Lee was allowed to dress again. Dodd noted that the boy seemed cheerful at that point. They watched Yogi Bear cartoons together on television, and Dodd added the new photos to his album. Dodd asked if Lee wanted to stay the night. When the boy said no, worried about his brother missing him, Dodd offered a trip to Kmart for a He-Man or RoboCop toy and McDonald's for a burger if he agreed to stay. Lee accepted the promise. At Kmart, Lee became upset again, crying and asking to go home. A store employee noticed, and Dodd calmly explained he was caring for his sister's child who was homesick. The worker accepted this. Dodd bought the RoboCop toy, which calmed Lee. They ate at McDonald's, let Lee play briefly on the outdoor equipment, and returned to the apartment around 6:30 in the evening. Back at the apartment, Lee played with his new toy while Dodd planned his next steps. In his journal, he wrote that he would wait until morning to end Lee's life, choosing a method that would be quick, quiet, and leave minimal visible signs. Later that evening, Dodd showed Lee the photo album again. The boy looked at his own pictures but said he did not want more taken. Dodd privately noted his plan to take final photographs the next morning. Lee fell asleep around 9:45. During the night, Dodd continued to violate the sleeping child. Lee stirred occasionally but remained mostly unaware due to exhaustion. Early the next morning, Dodd took Lee's life by asphyxiation. He then concealed the body in an upper closet shelf behind pillows, blankets, and a sleeping bag before leaving for work. That evening, after reading a short article about the disappearance in the Oregonian, Dodd retrieved the body, took additional photographs, and prepared for disposal using trash bags and gloves to avoid leaving evidence. He disposed of the remains in an undisclosed location before returning home by 8 at night. His journal entry recorded the events in detached, clinical detail, treating the loss of a 4-year-old's life as a routine task. On October 31, 1989, Detective Jensen interviewed Mark Prestwood, the brother of Justin Iselli, who described seeing Justin step out of a tan pickup truck with red pinstripes shortly after Lee disappeared, something Justin had not previously mentioned. When questioned again, Justin admitted parts of his earlier story were false. He said he had suggested a game where Lee would meet him inside Kianau's store, but the boys missed each other and became separated. After searching unsuccessfully, Justin accepted a ride from a man in a tan pickup truck who offered to help look for Lee. Detectives believed this account matched the evidence. Bloodhound scent trails to and from the store, witnesses who saw Lee inside alone, and the scent ending at the curb. Investigators concluded Justin had lied initially out of fear and guilt over losing his brother, not because he was involved in the disappearance. By Halloween night, after extensive searches and numerous tips that led nowhere, police acknowledged the likely reality. 4-year-old Lee Iselli had probably been abducted. As the FBI joined the investigation, the neighborhood grew quiet and uneasy. Across the river in Vancouver, Westley Allan Dodd followed the news coverage and quietly destroyed most of Lee's clothing and other evidence. Early on November 1, 1989, 67-year-old Hunter St. Elmo Abernathy discovered the naked body of a small boy in tall grass at the Washington State Game Preserve near Vancouver Lake, Clark County, Washington. He initially mistook it for a doll, but his bird dog's reaction confirmed it was real. Shaken, Abernathy drove to a payphone and called 911. Clark County Sheriff's Deputy Dave Lundy arrived, followed by Detectives Dave Trimble and Rick Buckner. From a distance, Trimble recognized the child as likely Lee Iselli, the 4-year-old missing from Portland since October 29th. Portland detectives Jensen and Ruby arrived shortly after and confirmed the match using a photo and later fingerprint identification. The body showed ligature marks on the neck, wrists, and ankles, with grass and debris loosely covering it. No clothing was found nearby, and the remains appeared casually discarded. Coroner Archie Hamilton noted signs consistent with asphyxiation. The scene was processed by a multi-agency team, including Vancouver police, due to possible links to the unsolved Neer brothers' murders 2 months earlier. A thorough grid search of the area recovered no victim clothing or significant evidence. The body was transported for autopsy in Portland, where Dr. Larry Luman ruled cause of death as asphyxiation, with evidence of prior misconduct confirmed by Dr. Jan Bays. Authorities formed a task force but publicly downplayed immediate connections to the Neer case, citing differences in method. Privately, some investigators suspected a link. Community fear grew, with calls for caution. A psychologist profiled the offender as likely a seemingly normal man driven by long-held fantasies. Despite a tip hotline and reward fund, leads quickly faded. The killer remained at large, leaving investigators and the grieving Iselli family without answers. The police investigation into Lee Iselli's abduction on October 29, 1989, intensified in early November, with Detective Jensen and others conducting door-to-door canvassing in southeast Portland, joined by the FBI due to the cross-state nature of the case. Leads, such as a reported sighting of Lee in a yellow car near Richmond School and checks on individuals matching descriptions like a man with a tan pickup and German Shepherd, quickly dead-ended despite interviews and clearances. A multi-agency task force was formalized between Portland and Clark County detectives, while hundreds of tips overwhelmed investigators. Community fear escalated, with parents keeping children indoors, and surveillance at Lee's candlelight vigil and funeral yielded no suspects. On Monday, November 13, 1989, Westley Allan Dodd prepared for another attempt. In his journal, he described rigging ropes to his bed frame for quick restraint of a future victim. He prayed to Satan for a boy that night, planning to keep the child captive for days by keeping him awake during the night to sleep while Dodd worked. He considered taping the mouth, cutting hair short, changing clothes for disguise, or even abducting 2 boys and forcing one to choose which would die. He also planned post-assault medical procedures and clearer photos. Around 5:25 that evening, he left for Camas, Washington, scouting parks before heading to the New Liberty Theater for an 8 o'clock showing of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. 6-year-old Steve Hall arrived with his mother, sister, and his mother's boyfriend, William Graves. They bought snacks and sat in the middle rows. Dodd sat in the back, scanning for targets. About 15 minutes into the film, a boy left for the restroom. Dodd followed immediately. Steve also needed the bathroom and entered shortly after. Inside, Dodd blocked Steve's exit after the boy finished. He said he was taking him outside and wouldn't hurt him. Steve protested, saying his mom was waiting. Dodd lifted Steve over his shoulder. The boy screamed and kicked. Dodd punched him in the chest to quiet him. Theater co-owner Kathy Asher heard the screams and sent employee Paul Hearn to check. Hearn saw Dodd carrying the struggling child and heard him say, "Calm down, son," casually as he passed. Co-owner Tony Ness joined, and they followed Dodd outside. Steve escaped Dodd's grip and ran back crying, "That man's trying to hurt me." Graves chased Dodd, who fled in his yellow 1974 Ford Pinto station wagon with wood grain paneling. The car stalled near the James River paper mill on 6th Avenue. Graves approached, offered help with the car trouble, then subdued Dodd with a chokehold and arm lock, saying, "This is it, you son of a bitch, you're done." Graves marched Dodd back to the theater, securing his wrists with his belt while witnesses confirmed the identification. Camas police officer Strong arrived, took statements, arrested Dodd for attempted kidnapping, and transported him to the station. During booking, Strong identified Dodd as Westley Allan Dodd, 28, from Vancouver, employed at Pack Paper. A records check revealed prior sex offenses involving minors, including a 1987 attempted abduction in Seattle. Detective Doug Slider interviewed Steve, noting minor reddening on his chest from the punch but no serious injury. Sergeant Don Cheney secured Dodd's stalled car at the mill lot. Noting Dodd's home near David Douglas Park, the near murders site, and workplace near Vancouver Lake, the Lee Iselli body site, Cheney delayed questioning and contacted Clark County detectives Bob Rayburn and Dave Trimble, who linked it to the task force. Rayburn and Rick Buckner arrived. They inspected the Pinto from outside, noting items like gloves and a toolbox, but nothing obviously incriminating. Trimble at home called Jensen. Both agreed to investigate immediately rather than wait, recognizing the potential breakthrough in the unsolved child murders. Westley Allan Dodd was interrogated by detectives Jensen and Dave Trimble at the Camas Police Department, following his arrest earlier that evening for attempting to abduct a young boy from a movie theater restroom. Dodd confessed to targeting the New Liberty Theater because a children's film, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, was showing, ensuring plenty of children would be present. He followed boys to the restroom area, approached 4-year-old Steve Hall, tried to lure him away, then forcibly picked him up and struck him when the child resisted and cried. He carried the boy outside but released him before fleeing. His car broke down, and a passerby detained him until police arrived. Dodd cooperated on this incident, likely to divert attention from suspicions linking him to the murders of the Neer brothers and Lee Iselli. On Labor Day, bored after moving into his own apartment without distractions like a TV, his thoughts became dark again. Dodd then detailed the long escalation of his sexual deviance, which he acknowledged had grown progressively more intense and serious over time. He admitted needing therapy to stop, as he would likely continue harming children without it, and expressed regret for past victims. His pattern began around age 9 with childhood curiosity, mutual touching with a cousin during pool play, followed by self-exploration like skinny dipping in his own pool and applying lotion, which brought unexplained excitement. Family moves and exposures added to his discomfort and fixation. By age 13, after starting puberty, he began exhibitionism, exposing himself from an upstairs window to boys aged 8 to 10 passing by, then from his bicycle while riding past children, often pleasuring himself afterward while fantasizing. He preferred boys, as they reported less often than girls. Seeking more than visual exposure, he progressed to physical contact around age 14 to 15. He tricked groups of children ages 7 to 10 into guessing games where they briefly groped him without looking. On one occasion, he led boys behind bushes for touch. Another time, he attempted forced contact with a young girl who resisted. During family visits around age 15, he violated his younger cousins. These incidents led to investigations and brief therapy, but no major charges, as he was seen as a nice kid. After high school, offenses continued, babysitting to access children, violating young kids, including infants and toddlers in some cases. In the Navy, he was discharged after sexual misconduct with minors on base. Post-Navy in Idaho and elsewhere, he repeatedly victimized family friends' children, leading to arrests, short jail time, probation, and counseling. He later quit. By his mid-20s, fantasies turned violent, planning abductions and murder to avoid witnesses and fulfill sadistic urges. He targeted vulnerable boys, using force when resisted. After Dodd explained the history of his deviant sexual behavior, detectives pressed him about the murders. After heavy pressure, Dodd broke down, asked for water, then directed detectives to a key on his ring that unlocked a briefcase under his bed, containing photos of Lee Selly and evidence related to the Neer brothers' murders. The interrogation shifted to obtaining a full confession from the beginning. Late that evening, while detectives Jensen and Trimble pressed Westley Allan Dodd further at the Camas Police Department, other officers visited his father's home in northeast Vancouver. The house appeared dark and quiet, but after persistent knocking around 11:10 at night, Jim Dodd answered, sleepy and surprised. He and his wife, Wesley's stepmother, invited the detectives in. They listened as officers explained Wesley's arrest in Camas earlier that night. Jim Dodd shared fragments of his son's troubled history: early arrests in Richland during high school, a Navy discharge after an incident involving young boys, treatment attempts that failed, and a later conviction in Lewiston, Idaho, possibly tied to child-related offenses. He described Wesley as passive, a loner who loved music, rarely socialized, and had lived with him briefly that summer after moving from Renton. Jim knew little about recent activities or connections to Portland, and he expressed frustration that counseling had never truly helped his son. Back at the station, the interrogation intensified. Dodd, now confronted directly, began confessing to the murders of brothers Billy and Cole Neer. He recounted spotting them with bikes on wooded trails in David Douglas Park on Labor Day. Armed with a concealed 6-inch knife, he ordered them to follow him off the path, forced one to undress, and performed before attempting intercourse. When that failed and resistance arose, he stabbed both boys repeatedly to silence them and prevent identification, citing his criminal record as motivation. He chased down the fleeing Billy, stabbed him again, then checked the scene to avoid leaving evidence. Dodd discarded the knife in a work dumpster days later and kept newspaper clippings about the case in a briefcase at home. Dodd then detailed the abduction and killing of 4-year-old Lee Selly. He lured the boy from a Portland playground using gentle baby talk, took him to his apartment, photographed him nude after briefly restraining him with ropes for images, violated him repeatedly throughout the night, and burned most of his clothes afterward. The next morning, facing work, Dodd choked Lee first by hand, then with rope, hanging the body in a closet for photos before storing it on a shelf. After work, he violated the corpse, photographed it again, bagged the remains, and dumped them near Vancouver Lake. He retained Lee's underwear for personal use and preserved clippings, a diary of his crimes and photos in the briefcase. Throughout the lengthy session, with Vancouver Detective Sunby joining, Dodd showed eerie calm mixed with occasional unease, admitting his escalating fantasies had shifted from assault in a sexual manner to violence and murder to eliminate witnesses. He acknowledged knowing his acts were wrong, influenced by stress and media reports, yet felt unable to stop without intervention. Detectives, horrified by the graphic accounts, secured search warrants and later recovered the damning briefcase contents, confirming his role in the 3 killings. In the early morning hours of November 14, 1989, shortly after Westley Allan Dodd confessed, investigators quickly began verifying his movements and background. Around 4:45 in the morning, Detective Rick Buckner, Deputy Jeff Smith, and FBI agent Michael Sanders went to the Vancouver home of Dodd's landlady, Bernice Walker. They informed her of Dodd's arrest for attempted kidnapping but did not reveal the suspected connection to the murders of the Neer brothers or the disappearance of Lee Selly. Walker described Dodd as polite, quiet, and dependable. He paid rent on time, kept mostly to himself, and followed a predictable routine of leaving for work in the morning and returning by mid-afternoon. Walker recalled that on October 29th, the day Selly disappeared, she had been at church from about 10 a.m. until 12:30 p.m. When she returned, Dodd was gone, but later came back, left briefly again, and then departed around 8 in the evening for roughly 2 hours. She never heard a child in the apartment or saw anything suspicious. Investigators also interviewed Dodd's neighbor, Larry Barnes, who said he once saw a young blonde boy watching television in Dodd's apartment in October. Dodd had told him the child was his nephew staying overnight. However, when detectives contacted Dodd's family, they learned his sister had no young biological children matching that description. When shown a photograph of Lee Iselli later that morning, Barnes said the boy looked similar to the child he had seen, noting the same blonde hair and blue eyes. Meanwhile, investigators spoke with supervisors at Dodd's workplace, Pack Paper, who described him as a reliable and hardworking employee. Records confirmed he had been off work on Labor Day, the day the Neer brothers were killed, and again on October 29th when Iselli disappeared. A co-worker also recalled Dodd appearing unusually withdrawn when the Iselli case was discussed. Together, these interviews began linking Dodd's quiet public image to the crimes he had confessed, as detectives prepared to search his apartment for evidence. On November 14, 1989, detectives obtained search warrants for Westley Allan Dodd's Vancouver apartment and his Ford Pinto. That evening, investigators entered the carefully kept apartment, videotaped the interior, and began collecting evidence. Among the items seized were ropes and belts that could be used as restraints, X-Acto knives, bedding, a stained wooden shelf from the closet, and a homemade wooden frame rigged with ropes that Dodd's writings later described as a torture rack. Technicians also gathered carpeting samples, garbage bags, ashes from a backyard burn barrel, and trace evidence such as hairs and fibers. The most significant discovery was a briefcase hidden beneath Dodd's bed. Inside were boys' underwear matching those worn by Lee Iselli, a handwritten diary in which Dodd had recorded his crimes, and a photo album documenting the victimization and killing of the children. Reading excerpts intensified the detective's disgust and anger. The journal chronicled his offenses with explicit dates, times, and descriptions, serving both as a personal record and powerful incriminating evidence. Investigators also found newspaper clippings about the murders of Lee Iselli and the Neer brothers. Forensic testing later linked numerous items from the apartment to Lee Iselli through hairs, fingerprints, and other physical evidence. Based on the evidence in Dodd's confession, prosecutors charged him with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder for the deaths of Lee Iselli and brothers Billy and Cole Neer and announced they would seek the death penalty. Dodd also faced 1 count each of first-degree attempted kidnapping and first-degree attempted murder in the Commas Theater incident involving Steve Hall. The next morning, Westley Allan Dodd appeared in court and entered not guilty pleas despite his earlier admissions. While full forensic reports were still pending, early lab work already confirmed that Lee Iselli had been inside Dodd's apartment. Using the low-card exchange principle, investigators identified 68 pieces of evidence linking the two. Forensic analysts matched one of Lee's hairs on Dodd's bedsheets. They found blood-type consistent stains on a closet shelf, and most significantly identified Lee's fingerprint on a desk stapler along with 2 toe prints and a footprint near the closet. These findings strongly corroborated Dodd's confession. As investigators reviewed Dodd's history, it aligned strikingly with Dr. Turco's behavioral profile, itself rooted in the FBI's classic serial killer framework from John E. Douglas's Behavioral Sciences Unit. The crimes were clearly sexually driven, highly ritualistic, and followed a consistent observable pattern across incidents. This ritual structure enabled Dodd to enact his darkest fantasies within a self-justifying framework. Detectives recalled Cole Neer's terrified question, "Why are you doing this to us?" and Dodd's chilling reply, "Because I have to do it." Just when detectives believed they had uncovered the full extent of Westley Allan Dodd's crimes, disturbing new information surfaced. Although Detective Rick Buckner had previously heard vague allegations from Anna Hoggs that Dodd had violated the infant son of a former roommate, Mark Nolan, the full story did not emerge until January 5, 1990. That afternoon, while Buckner worked at his desk, he received a call from Clark County Jail Counselor Rita Laurent. Dodd was with her and had specifically requested to speak with Buckner. Buckner agreed to meet and had Dodd brought to his office. When Dodd arrived about 20 minutes later, Buckner asked directly if the meeting concerned Mark Nolan. "Yes," Dodd replied after a brief pause. Dodd explained that while living with his sister and brother-in-law in Renton, a relative of his brother-in-law, Wayne Nolan, moved in temporarily while job hunting, bringing along his approximately 2-year-old son, Mark. The pair arrived in March 1987. Dodd helped Wayne secure employment, About 3 weeks later, Wayne needed someone to watch Mark during a work shift. Dodd, off that day, volunteered. "I'd seen the boy taking baths and changed his diapers a few times," Dodd said. "I'd thought a little bit about violating him." He went on to describe the infant and simulating intercourse. 3 months later came Dodd's Seattle arrest for attempted abduction. While he was jailed, Mark and Wayne relocated briefly to Sunnyside, Washington, but soon returned to Dodd's sister's apartment. Upon Dodd's release in early November, he moved back in with them in Renton. After Christmas, his sister and brother-in-law moved out, leaving Dodd alone with Wayne and Mark. It was then, he said, that his acts towards Mark intensified. Buckner asked whether Mark could yet speak or refuse. "No," Dodd replied. "He couldn't talk at all at that time." Buckner struggled to stay composed. For a moment he flashed back to the photograph of Lee Isley alive and bound on Dodd's bed, an image that still turned his stomach. But he forced himself to listen. Gathering every detail was essential. Even with Dodd's diary, photos, and prior confession already damning, additional admissions could prove vital if any evidence faced suppression at trial. Dodd recounted multiple episodes of unspeakable acts involving the 2-year-old over several months. Before concluding, he disclosed yet another incident, this one with an even younger victim, a boy about 1.5 years old. Buckner, who thought he had heard the worst, found himself once again profoundly disturbed by Dodd's revelations. On January 25, 1990, Westley Allan Dodd asked to meet with Detective Rick Buckner at the Clark County Jail. When Buckner arrived, Dodd handed him a letter addressed to prosecutors stating he wanted to plead guilty to all charges, despite his attorney's objections. Dodd insisted the decision was his alone and said he expected to receive the death penalty. In the weeks that followed, Dodd became increasingly withdrawn and emotional in jail. At one point, a guard found him sobbing in his cell, saying he kept thinking about the kids. He admitted contemplating suicide, but said he would not take his own life because the victims' families deserved justice. When asked what punishment he deserved, Dodd answered simply, "execution." While awaiting trial, Dodd also wrote letters and a pamphlet titled "When You Meet a Stranger," claiming it was meant to teach children how to resist predators. The document urged children to say no, run, and scream for help. When it was later published in a local newspaper, it sparked public outrage, with many believing it was a manipulative attempt to portray remorse before his trial. Despite strong protests from his lawyers, Westley Allan Dodd insisted on a special court hearing and received approval from Clark County Superior Court Judge Robert Harris. On June 11, 1990, he stood before the court, head lowered and voice flat, and asked to withdraw his not guilty pleas and instead plead guilty. Reading from a prepared statement, he openly admitted his crimes. "On September 4, 1989, I went to David Douglas Park with the deliberate plan to kill someone," Dodd said. "I met Cole Neer. I violated Cole Neer and then I killed him. At about the same time, I also murdered William Neer." He told the court he had brought a knife to the park with the intention of violating and killing a child, and that he killed the brothers to prevent them from identifying him. Dodd said he initially feared being caught, but that fear faded when he followed the news and realized investigators had no leads. "I was nervous and worried I might get caught," he said. "But when I saw the police had no leads, I grew more confident. I realized I could do it and escape detection. The next logical step was to kidnap a boy." Dodd went on to describe abducting Lee Isley from a Portland playground, taking him to his Vancouver apartment, violating him, and then killing him the following morning. Judge Harris asked whether the murder had been planned in advance or done impulsively. "No, sir," Dodd answered. "It was premeditated." He also acknowledged that during his attempt to kidnap Steve Hall at the Comus Theater, he had intended to violate and then kill the boy as well. The following month, a jury of 6 men and 6 women was seated for the penalty phase of Westley Allan Dodd's trial. Chief Deputy Prosecutor Roger Bennett explained that the jurors' task was not to determine guilt. Dodd had already admitted to the crimes, but to decide between the death penalty and life imprisonment. Bennett reviewed Dodd's history of offenses, leading to the crimes and his detailed confessions. He presented photos of the victims and played a 20-minute police video showing the discovery of Lee Isley's body. The 2-week hearing focused heavily on Dodd's personal diary, which contained detailed accounts of the crimes and plans for future offenses. Bennett highlighted entries in which Dodd described making a pact with Satan, calling the devil a love god and praying for help in selecting the chosen ones. The prosecutor argued that the diary demonstrated Dodd's intent to commit many more long-term abductions and serious crimes against young children, including his desire to harm victims before ending their lives. Bennett displayed drawings from the diary of a restraint device Dodd had designed to hold children. The diary also listed various methods Dodd had considered for future crimes, all referred to as his experiments. He showed a map Dodd drew of David Douglas Park, with an entry calling it a good hunting ground for his depraved acts. Bennett read Dodd's own words that he got more of a high out of the killing than his sexual acts. Prosecutor Art Curtis, his voice sometimes breaking with emotion, told the jury, "Cole and William Neer died in David Douglas Park on Labor Day as victims of the hunt. At least 20 other children escaped harm through sheer luck that same weekend. Do you wonder where those children are today?" He described Lee Isley's final hours. Lee Isley met a friendly man at the playground who offered to buy him a toy and give him money. Lee did exactly what we teach children never to do. Little did he know, while he played happily in Mr. Dodd's apartment the night before he died, that Mr. Dodd was sitting there writing in his diary. Curtis then read the chilling entry. 6:30 p.m. Lee is still playing. We'll probably wait until morning to kill him. He suspects nothing now. That way his body will still be fairly fresh for experiments after work. On July 15, 1990, after more than 14 hours of deliberation, a jury sentenced Westley Allan Dodd to death. 2 days later, in a television interview, Dodd said he wanted the sentence carried out as quickly as possible and chose hanging over lethal injection. Explaining why, he said simply, "The main reason is because that's the way Lee Isley died." Unlike most condemned inmates, Dodd repeatedly asked the courts to waive all appeals. Writing to the Washington Supreme Court, he accepted full responsibility for the murders, stating, "The system did not kill 3 boys. I did." He warned that if he ever escaped prison, he would commit more violence, insisting that execution was the only outcome he deserved. Shortly after midnight on January 5, 1993, Dodd was led to the gallows inside Washington State Penitentiary. Before the hood and noose were placed over his head, he delivered a final statement. "I was once asked by somebody, I don't remember who, if there was any way sex offenders could be stopped. I said no, I was wrong. I was wrong when I said there was no hope, no peace. There is hope, there is peace. I found both in the Lord, Jesus Christ. Look to the Lord, and you will find peace." After he finished, an opaque screen was lowered over the upper windows to shield the identities of the executioners. A backlight illuminated Dodd's silhouette as he stepped onto the trapdoor. One executioner, chewing gum, placed a dark hood over his head to spare witnesses the sight of facial contortions during the hanging. Another positioned the noose around his neck, adjusting the knot behind his left ear. Dodd's hands were strapped in front and his ankles bound together. He remained cooperative throughout and did not require the wooden collapse board to remain upright. He appeared fully prepared. Barely any time passed between his final statement and the moment he stood over the trapdoor. At the signal, one of the hangmen pressed a button. With a sharp crack, the trapdoor opened, and Dodd dropped 7 feet 1 inch, the distance calculated for his height of 5 feet 9 inches. His body remained visible in the lower chamber for just over a minute before Warden Tana Wood closed the screen. A physician pronounced him dead at 12:09 in the morning, and his body was lowered and removed. Westley Allan Dodd is gone, as are his victims. Whether his late expressions of remorse were genuine will never be fully known. What matters most is that the lessons of this case endure. We must never forget what happened to Billy Neer, Cole Neer, and Lee Isley at the hands of Westley Allan Dodd. To allow their tragic, senseless deaths to fade from memory would render them meaningless. While progress has been made in addressing child predators, much work remains. Until predators like Dodd can be reliably identified and removed from society, vigilance is essential. Other individuals with the same sinister desires are out there right now, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the opportunity to strike. The man later branded the Monster of the Andes was taken into custody in 1980, after authorities linked him to the deaths of 110 girls, most between 8 and 12 years old. The victims were overwhelmingly children from impoverished families. girls who spent their days working beside parents in open-air markets, selling goods to supplement household income. Investigators believed the confirmed number represented only a fraction of the total. By Lopez's own admissions and the scope of the evidence, the true figure was likely far higher, possibly exceeding 300 victims spread across multiple countries. When asked to explain his fixation on young girls, Lopez responded with chilling casualness. He compared them to livestock, remarking that one would not choose old meat when younger flesh was available. The comment was not an admission of cannibalism. There was none, but it revealed the depth of his detachment. He did not perceive his victims as children or as individuals tethered to families. To him, they were objects, stripped of identity and value. Lopez told investigators that the compulsion to kill surfaced with mechanical regularity, approximately every 3 days. Following his arrest, he displayed no visible distress as he escorted police across remote terrain in Ecuador, guiding them to burial sites scattered across the countryside. At 53 locations, human remains were recovered. He did not hesitate. He recalled each grave precisely. Pedro Lopez was born on October 8, 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia. He was the 7th of 13 children raised by his mother, Benilda Lopez de Castaneda, a woman who survived through prostitution. His biological father, Ricardo Reyes, was affiliated with Colombia's Conservative Party. Reyes was killed during a riot while Benilda was 3 months pregnant. He was not her husband. Benilda later described the moment she learned of Reyes's death as debilitating. She believed the shock might cause her to lose the child, but claimed she could still feel him moving. She spoke of her unborn son as resilient, attributing his survival to what she called strong blood. At the time, prostitution in Colombia was, and remains, legal in designated zones, a system shaped by entrenched poverty and limited economic mobility. For many women, it was not an underground trade, but a visible part of daily life in neighborhoods where survival outweighed stigma. According to his mother, Lopez showed signs of gentleness as a child. She claimed he once aspired to become a teacher and took pleasure in helping other children learn basic lessons, using his notebook to teach them their vowels. Those ambitions did not survive his home environment. Lopez later described his childhood in blunt terms. As one of 13 children, he said they slept together on a single large bed, separated from their mother by a curtain while she brought men into the room to work. Privacy did not exist. Neither did stability. He characterized his mother as volatile and punitive. Discipline, he said, was delivered through force rather than guidance. The violence in his telling was frequent and deliberate, an atmosphere where punishment was not corrective but retaliatory. The circumstances surrounding Pedro Lopez's departure from home are contested. His mother and Lopez himself offered accounts that could not be reconciled. In her version, Lopez vanished at the age of 8. She claimed he left without explanation and that she searched for him throughout the day, growing increasingly frantic as night fell. When her efforts failed, she said despair overtook her, and she eventually consulted a fortune teller, an act born less from belief than from desperation. Lopez described a far harsher rupture. He said that in 1957, his mother discovered him engaging in inappropriate behavior with his younger sister. According to Lopez, she washed her hands of him. He claimed she removed him from the home and left him outside the town. After finding his way back on his own, he said she ensured there would be no second return, placing him on a bus and abandoning him hundreds of miles away from his family. From there, Lopez drifted toward Bogotá, the nation's capital, where abandoned children occupied the margins of the city. They were invisible to most and unprotected by any system. Criminal psychologist Alexandra de la Torre d'Aramillo later explained that many of these children shared similar origins. Abuse, she said, was often the precipitating factor. Once they fled or were expelled, the streets became permanent. There were no shelters waiting to receive them, no safety nets to catch them. Lopez survived the way most did. He scavenged what others discarded, stole what he could not find, and attached himself to a group of other homeless youths. Known locally as gamines, they formed loose alliances for mutual protection, particularly during the night. The arrangement offered little security and no stability. It did not prevent what followed. Lopez said that while living on the streets, he was approached by an older man who appeared sympathetic to his condition. The man provided meals and a place to sleep, presenting himself as a rescuer. Lopez said he was taken to a derelict building and subjected to repeated sexual assaults. When the man lost interest, Lopez was expelled once again, returned to the streets without explanation or support. Years later, Lopez would frame this experience as a turning point. He said the abuse extinguished what remained of his childhood and planted the belief that harm could be repaid in kind, that suffering could be redirected rather than endured. By the time Pedro Lopez reached the age of 12, he had already spent nearly half his life navigating the streets without supervision. His circumstances briefly shifted when an older couple from the United States intervened, offering him a room, regular meals, and enrollment in a school intended for children without families. For the first time in years, he lived within a structured environment governed by schedules and rules. That stability proved short-lived. While attending the school, Lopez later claimed he was sexually assaulted by a teacher. The setting that promised protection instead reinforced a lesson he had learned repeatedly, that trust carried risk and safety was conditional. Rather than remain, he fled. Lopez stole a small amount of money from the school administration, just enough to fund his escape, and disappeared once again. He returned to Bogotá, drawn back to the streets he viewed as the only place he understood. At the same time, Colombia was attempting to recover from prolonged political unrest and economic stagnation. Factories reopened, and signs of industrial life returned. For many, opportunity followed. For Lopez, it did not. Having lived without stable shelter since early childhood, he lacked the education, skills, and documentation needed to enter legal employment or secure housing. His brief exposure to formal schooling had not altered his position within society. Colombia's social support systems offered little practical assistance to children in his situation. While programs existed in theory, access was fragmented and largely inaccessible to those already living outside institutional reach. There was no effective mechanism to pull him back in. He returned to the strategies that had kept him alive before. He begged when necessary, and stole when he could not. Over time, he became known among Bogotá's street population for his ability to take vehicles quickly and quietly, establishing a reputation that ensured survival but offered no path beyond it. Stealing cars proved lucrative. Lopez earned steady money from local dismantling operations, enough to establish a degree of status among Bogotá's street population. In that role, he gravitated toward younger children, instructing them in the techniques he had mastered, showing them how to move unnoticed, how to work quickly, how not to panic. In his own way, he was fulfilling an earlier ambition, teaching. The arrangement did not last. Mistakes were inevitable, even for someone skilled. Lopez was eventually caught, and at 18 years old he was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The transition from the streets to confinement was abrupt and unforgiving. Within days of his incarceration, Lopez was sexually assaulted by older inmates. The experience resurfaced earlier traumas and shattered any remaining belief that submission ensured survival. He spiraled into an uncontrollable rage. In the weeks that followed, 3 inmates were killed during confrontations involving Lopez. Authorities later classified the incidents as acts of self-defense, involving a crude, improvised weapon. The events marked Lopez's first confirmed killings. He later acknowledged responsibility for 2 of the deaths, but claimed prison officials discouraged further scrutiny. Whether true or not, the message he took from the experience was unmistakable. He decided he would never again occupy the role of the powerless. From that point forward, Lopez framed his life not as a series of reactions but as a choice. Whatever restraint might once have existed was gone. The trajectory ahead, violent, deliberate, and unchecked, had begun to take shape. When Lopez was released from prison in 1971, the trajectory of his life had already been profoundly altered. Years of exposure to violence, sexual exploitation, and instability, beginning in childhood and continuing through incarceration, had reshaped how he understood blame, power, and responsibility. In his own thinking, resentment no longer attached to individuals. It expanded outward. Women as a category became targets for the anger he carried toward his mother. This pattern was not unfamiliar to those who studied serial violence. Former FBI profiler Robert Ressler noted that fixation on the mother figure appears frequently in the psychological histories of serial offenders. These relationships, he explained, are often marked by contradiction, attachment mixed with hostility. The mothers themselves are not always overtly abusive, nor are they uniformly neglectful. What emerges more consistently is early exposure to adult sexual behavior, particularly in environments where boundaries are absent or blurred. Ressler observed that children raised in such conditions, especially those aware of their mother's sexual relationships, are more likely to internalize confusion, resentment, and distorted associations between intimacy and control. In cases involving prostitution, that exposure is often unavoidable. Over time, those unresolved conflicts can harden into fixation, shaping how the offender later directs aggression. Driven by a desire he framed as retaliation, Lopez crossed south into Peru. There, he began a campaign that would leave a lasting scar, one carried out not against those who had harmed him directly, but against children with the least protection. His targets were drawn from the poorest families, often girls who spent long hours helping their parents in open-air markets. Lopez later described his selection process as deliberate. He said he moved through crowded marketplaces, watching for a child who appeared compliant and unguarded, someone who seemed dutiful, quiet, and attentive to her work beside her mother. Once identified, he did not act immediately. He claimed he sometimes followed a child and her family for days, waiting for a moment when supervision weakened. When the opportunity came, he used small offerings to establish familiarity. A cheap object, a minor kindness, nothing that would alarm a parent struggling to earn a living. He would then lead the child away, offering assurances framed as help or reward, often invoking the promise of something for the family as well. Criminal psychologist Alexandra de la Torre d'Aramillo later explained why the approach worked so consistently. Children living in poverty, she noted, are conditioned to respond to assistance. When someone presents himself as helpful, the instinct is to trust. Lopez exploited that instinct, guiding his victims to locations where isolation was complete and intervention impossible. The method did not change. The circumstances varied, but the structure remained intact. Lopez repeated the same pattern again and again, refining it through repetition, driven by impulses that did not diminish with use. Lopez saw Peru as the right place to begin. It was a country defined by distance and contrast, stretching from the Pacific coast through the Andes Mountains and into the Amazon basin, with entire regions separated by terrain that swallowed people without notice. To him, it offered space to move, to disappear, and to act without drawing immediate attention. What followed no longer resembled impulse. It looked planned. For the families left behind, the uncertainty was unbearable. Most of the missing girls were young, typically between 8 and 12 years old, and had been sent out for ordinary reasons. They were helping sell goods, running errands, or expected to return home within hours. One mother, Mara Masbande Inde, later recalled giving her daughter simple instructions she had given countless times before: sell a few items, buy a bus ticket, come back home. Her daughter never arrived. She never returned to the place she had grown up. Other parents searched for explanations that allowed for survival, even if the possibilities were grim. Some believed their daughters had been taken into sex trafficking networks. The idea was horrifying, but it carried a sliver of hope that the child might still be alive somewhere. In time, even that belief began to feel unlikely. As days passed with no word, desperation turned public. Parents placed notices in local newspapers, offering rewards for any information, begging for sightings, pleading for answers. No one responded. No leads surfaced, and the silence only deepened. Lopez was not stopped quickly. By the time he was finally intercepted, Years had passed and countless women and young girls had already been murdered. In 1978, his movements ended abruptly in rural Peru when members of an Ayacucho tribe caught him attempting to abduct a 9-year-old girl. What followed was not a handover to authorities. The community acted on its own. Lopez was detained by the villagers and subjected to hours of punishment they believed matched the gravity of what he was accused of attempting. He was beaten, then buried upright with only his head exposed. Syrup was poured over his neck and face, intended to draw ants as part of a form of retribution the community viewed as justified for someone suspected of harming children. Lopez likely would have died there, and countless young girls across South America might have been spared, if not for the intervention of a female missionary. She urged the villagers to abandon their plans to kill him and instead turn him over to authorities. They did. The decision proved disastrous. Police dismissed the accounts given by members of the Ayacucho community and declined to pursue the allegations seriously. Lopez was released. He fled north into Ecuador. There, his violence escalated. He began killing at a relentless pace, sometimes as many as 3 girls a week. At times, he crossed back over the border into Colombia, returning briefly to his home country to find victims before slipping away again. For Lopez, the act itself was never the end goal. What followed mattered more. He later made clear that watching his victims die held greater significance for him than the assault that preceded it. Control, not desire, was the driving force. In interviews, he described those moments in chilling detail. He spoke about placing his hands around a young girl's throat and watching her eyes as life drained from them. He fixated on what he called a visible change, a light extinguishing, a presence disappearing. To Lopez, that instant was not horrifying, it was affirming. He insisted that only those who had killed could understand what he felt in that moment. Death, as he described it, was not incidental or accidental. It was the point at which the experience became complete, something he found deeply absorbing and intensely satisfying. Lopez had grown up without any lasting sense of control. As a child, authority figures had repeatedly violated him, leaving power associated not with safety, but with domination. As an adult, killing became the means by which he tried to reclaim what he believed had been taken from him, even as he was extinguishing the lives of others. Psychiatrist Maria Helena Trujillo later noted that Lopez himself pointed to poverty as part of his justification. He targeted girls who were poor, she said, possibly because he associated poverty with weakness. By destroying those he viewed as vulnerable, he could invert his own sense of helplessness. In those moments, Trujillo explained, Lopez felt larger, stronger, briefly elevated above the insignificance he had carried since childhood. His crimes followed a deliberate pattern. Lopez often abducted his victims at night but waited until daylight to act. The delay was intentional. He wanted them conscious, aware, and afraid. The passage of the night was part of the ordeal he imposed. He later spoke openly about this preference. Dawn, he said, intensified the experience. As the light returned, he sexually assaulted his victims and then killed them, watching their expressions as it happened. Visibility mattered to him. Darkness, he claimed, diminished the act. He insisted he never killed at night, believing that death unseen was meaningless. For Lopez, fear witnessed was essential. Without it, the act held no value. Lopez later acknowledged that death did not always come immediately. In some cases, his victims lost consciousness and then revived, forcing him to continue until life finally left them. He spoke about the process in measured terms, estimating that it could take anywhere from several minutes to much longer before it was over. He claimed the girls rarely cried out. According to him, they did not anticipate harm. They trusted. He described them as innocent. That word, innocent, was one he returned to repeatedly. It was the same term he used when speaking about himself as a child. Before, he said that trust had been shattered by an adult who promised food and shelter and instead subjected him to prolonged abuse. In his telling, that early betrayal became a reference point, one he later twisted to justify what he did to others. After his victims were dead, Lopez did not leave immediately. Instead, he lingered. He arranged their bodies together in shared burial sites, positioning them as if they were still present, still participating. He spoke to them. In his mind, the grave became a place of imagined interaction, something he later described as companionship rather than disposal. He claimed he often placed several girls in the same pit, returning to talk to them as though they were still listening. Over time, he said, the stillness bored him. Once they could no longer respond, even in his imagination, he moved on, searching for new victims. As the disappearances mounted, police began to notice the pattern. Reports accumulated. Parents filed complaints. But investigators, like many grieving families, settled on an explanation that required less immediate action. They assumed the girls had been taken into trafficking networks and did not pursue the cases beyond that theory. One such disappearance involved the sister of Amparo Garces Lozada. The girl had been selling newspapers when she encountered Lopez. He drew her away from the market, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and attempted to conceal her body beneath the very papers she had been selling only moments earlier. When the child failed to return home, her family searched for help, but there was little to be found. In Colombia, access to police protection was uneven at best. For poor families, options were limited, delays were common, and intervention, when it came at all, often came too late. Days later, Lopez took the daughter of a well-known local baker. Her disappearance carried more weight than the others. The family's standing ensured attention, and with it came renewed scrutiny of the growing list of missing girls that had previously drawn little response. The child was eventually located in an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town. By the time she was found, her body was badly decomposed, leaving little opportunity to determine exactly how she had died. Even then, the case did not immediately shift how authorities viewed the disappearances. Authorities continued to frame the disappearances as isolated events. Families were told their daughters had likely wandered off or fallen victim to trafficking. Without bodies, there was no murder to investigate, only absence. That changed in April of 1980. Near Ambato, heavy rains caused a sudden flood. Water tore through fields and low-lying ground, stripping away layers of soil that had hidden what Lopez left behind. When the water receded, the remains of 4 young girls surfaced. The bodies were badly decomposed. Precise causes of death could not be determined, but the manner of burial was unmistakable. These were not accidental deaths. The girls had been placed deliberately, concealed beneath the earth. For the first time, authorities were forced to confront a possibility they had avoided. The danger had not come from outside their communities. It had been operating nearby, unseen and uninterrupted. Only days later, Lopez came within seconds of disappearing again. At a local market, Carvina Poveda noticed a man attempting to pull her daughter, Marie, away from the crowd. She screamed. The sound cut through the market. Vendors and shoppers rushed toward them, surrounding Lopez and forcing him to the ground before he could escape with the child. When police arrived, Lopez tried to derail the situation. He spoke erratically, presenting himself as mentally ill and unstable. The act failed. He was taken into custody. This time, there was no release. During interrogation, Lopez refused to speak. He offered no explanation, no denial, no cooperation. Hours passed, then days. Investigators reached a dead end, so they changed tactics. Investigators eventually shifted strategy. An undercover officer, posing as an inmate, was placed in Lopez's cell. The approach relied on proximity rather than pressure. Alone with someone he believed to be another prisoner, Lopez lowered his guard. Before long, he began to talk. For nearly a month, the man placed in Lopez's cell barely slept. Pastor Gonzalez later said he lived in constant fear that he would be attacked in the night. He wrapped a towel around his neck before lying down, a crude precaution against what he believed Lopez might do while he slept. Gonzalez said the only way to survive the assignment was to gain Lopez's trust. He claimed he did so by presenting himself as someone capable of understanding him, someone who shared his appetite for violence. The tactic worked. Once Lopez believed he was among his own, he began to boast. According to Gonzalez, the confessions came quickly and relentlessly. Lopez spoke about killing again and again, moving across Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru with ease. The scope of what he described went far beyond anything Gonzalez had anticipated. In an interview with freelance reporter Ron Leitner, Gonzalez said Lopez spoke freely, offering details without prompting. The volume alone was overwhelming. Eventually, Gonzalez asked to be removed from the cell. He said the stories became unbearable, not because he doubted them, but because he believed them. He no longer wanted to hear what Lopez was willing to share. Once his cover collapsed, Lopez stopped resisting. He told investigators he had killed at least 100 girls in Ecuador, another 100 in Colombia, and more than 100 in Peru. He spoke of the numbers plainly, as if they reflected capacity rather than consequence. He then began directing police to where the bodies were hidden. Officers followed Lopez across fields and remote stretches of land as he pointed out burial sites one by one. Witnesses later recalled that few people realized who he was. Dressed in police clothing and moving openly with authorities, he blended in. No one suspected the man guiding officers through the countryside was the one responsible. At one site, Lopez led police to the remains of a girl concealed beneath branches and old newspapers. Her family identified her by the clothing still wrapped around her bones. Officials later remarked on his demeanor during the process. Lopez showed no visible emotion as he marked each grave. He behaved as if the task were routine, as if the deaths required no reflection. To keep him cooperative, investigators provided cigarettes, coffee, food, and alcohol. Lopez spoke freely. He described his crimes without hesitation, sometimes framing himself as a caretaker rather than a killer. He claimed he brought the girls to secluded locations where graves had already been prepared. In some cases, earlier victims were already buried there. He spoke of staying with the children, holding them, and sexually assaulting them after sunrise. As daylight strengthened, he said, he ended their lives. He described squeezing the life out of them slowly, deliberately, checking repeatedly to be certain they were no longer breathing. He insisted he was careful, thorough. According to Lopez, the girls never screamed. They never had the chance. Lopez claimed his victims rarely cried out because they never anticipated danger. He described the girls in Ecuador as particularly trusting, more open, more easily reassured. In his telling, that innocence made them desirable. He contrasted their vulnerability with his own past, repeatedly returning to the idea that he had once been the same. Cast out as a child, sexually assaulted by adults who offered protection, and forced to survive without guidance or restraint. Where his life had hardened into violence, he insisted theirs never would have had the chance. For 6 weeks, Lopez traveled with police across Ecuador, moving from one burial site to the next. He navigated the terrain from memory, pointing out locations without hesitation. Officers later noted the absence of emotion. There was no visible regret, no hesitation, only recall. At one site, he attempted to lift a victim's skull, apparently hoping to be photographed with it. Officers intervened immediately and removed the remains from his reach. By the end of the search, Lopez had led police to the graves of 53 victims. He then refused to continue. Investigators believed the number represented only a portion of the total. Back at the station, Lopez was formally charged with 110 counts of murder, based on recovered remains and his own admissions. In a press briefing, Victor Lascano acknowledged the scope of the case. When a suspect confesses to dozens of confirmed killings and claims responsibility for hundreds more, he said, the estimate cannot be dismissed lightly. He added that Lopez's own figure, 300, was likely conservative. As evidence was catalogued, officers processed what remained: bones, skulls, shoes, fragments of clothing. The accumulation told a story on its own, one of repeated deliberate killing carried out over years. Lopez later attempted to explain himself. He attributed his actions to his life on the margins, describing himself as someone who had grown up stripped of dignity and guidance. He spoke of being abandoned, unsupported, and left to survive without structure. What he claimed he needed most, he said, was help. The statement arrived far too late. In Ecuador, the punishment for murder does not increase with the body count. Whether one life was taken or hundreds, The sentence remained the same. Lopez received 16 years in prison. In 1994, after serving his term, he was released for good behavior. He was 45 years old. Authorities transported him to the Colombian border. There, the process ended without ceremony. Officials provided him with a bottle of water, clean clothes, a small amount of Colombian currency, and basic food. Then they let him go. After years of confinement and countless deaths, Pedro Lopez was simply released back into the world. When Lopez was released after serving his sentence in Ecuador, officials pointed to the limits of the law itself. At the time, Prisons Minister Pablo Figuero explained that the country's sentencing structure had little flexibility, regardless of the crime. The law, he said, was rooted in history. More than a century earlier, Ecuador had abolished executions and capped prison sentences at 20 years as a safeguard against political violence. The intent was to prevent future presidents from being killed during revolutions or military coups, a fate earlier leaders had sometimes met in brutal fashion. By comparison, the reform had been seen as humane. For the families left behind, that explanation offered little comfort. Whether the number was 100 or closer to 300, the outcome was the same. Daughters gone, futures erased. Mothers were denied the chance to see their children grow into adulthood. Fathers were left without the lives they had imagined unfolding before them. Whatever restraint the law was meant to impose, it did nothing to address the scale of what had been taken. And when Lopez walked free, the weight of that loss did not lift. It settled, quietly and permanently, on those who were left to live with it. One grieving mother spoke openly about it. She said she wanted vengeance, that she wanted him destroyed for taking her child. Others echoed the sentiment in different ways. In one case, a friend of a bereaved father gathered wood with the intention of setting Lopez on fire, invoking punishments from another era as the only response that felt proportionate. The fury did not fade quietly. Public outrage over the Lopez case eventually forced a reckoning inside Ecuador's legal system. Lawmakers moved to amend sentencing guidelines, increasing the maximum punishment for murder. What had once been capped at 16 years was raised to 25. The change came too late for the families who had already buried their children, but it stood as an acknowledgement that what had been done and what had been allowed to happen afterward could not be justified again. Families who demanded accountability were briefly given reason to believe it might come. Roughly an hour after Lopez crossed back into Colombia, authorities arrested him in connection with a murder committed 2 decades earlier. The relief was short-lived. He was soon declared legally insane and transferred to the psychiatric wing of a hospital in Bogotá, rather than sent to prison. At the time, it appeared to be a permanent solution confinement without release. Many assumed the region would never have to reckon with him again, that he would disappear into institutional custody, known less for punishment than permanent isolation. That assumption proved wrong. In February 1998, Lopez was released from psychiatric confinement after a prison psychiatrist concluded that he was no longer mentally ill. The decision raised immediate doubts. Criminal psychologist Jaramillo later suggested 2 possibilities. Either the evaluation was sincere, or Lopez had successfully deceived those responsible for assessing him. She noted that he was intelligent and capable of manipulation, fully able to present himself as rehabilitated if it served his interests. Upon regaining his freedom, Lopez went to see his mother. According to her account, he arrived unannounced and demanded that she kneel so he could bless her. She refused, telling him that a son kneels before his mother, not the other way around. Lopez complied, but only partially, lowering himself onto a single knee. What followed was not reconciliation. Lopez asked what she intended to give him as part of his inheritance. She told him there was nothing to give, only a chair and a bed. Lopez carried both outside and placed them on the porch. He then warned her that if no one bought them, he would burn them rather than allow her to keep them. It was a final act of control, directed at the woman who had brought him into the world. A passerby eventually bought the few possessions Benilda Lopez de Castaneda owned, a chair and a bed. Lopez took the money, turned away, and vanished. No confirmed sighting followed. It was the last time anyone could say with certainty where he was. Pedro Lopez walked away without supervision, without monitoring, and without restraint. And he has never been seen again. Across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, the news of Lopez's release left families on edge. Parents became more vigilant. Girls were watched more closely. From time to time, reports surfaced claiming sightings in the regions where he had once operated. Police circulated his photograph, holding on to the possibility that he might reappear. There was little structure behind the concern. Lopez had been ordered to appear before a judge once a month after his release, a measure intended to impose oversight. It failed immediately. After his final encounter with his mother, he disappeared into the countryside, slipping beyond reach without resistance. Former prison warden Victor Lascano warned that nothing had changed. He described Lopez as unreformed and without remorse, cautioning that the danger had not passed. The fear, he said, was not hypothetical. It could begin again. Over the years, theories replaced certainty. Some believed Lopez was dead, killed quietly by vigilantes seeking retribution. Others pointed to occasional disappearances as evidence that he might still be alive. In 2002, those fears resurfaced when authorities issued a new arrest warrant after the bodies of young girls were discovered, under circumstances that echoed Lopez's earlier crimes. However, he was nowhere to be found. The possibility alone was enough to unsettle entire communities. One mother, whose daughter had survived an attempted abduction and helped expose Lopez years earlier, spoke openly about the fear that lingered. She said the world would be safer if he were gone, convinced that he could not live freely for long without consequence. Whether justice had already been carried out, she said, might explain why no definitive sightings had followed. Pedro Lopez vanished without confirmation of death, without accountability, and without closure. And in parts of South America, the question has never fully gone away, whether the nightmare ended or simply went quiet. In the Soviet Union of the early 1960s, surviving the street was often a matter of chance. Pedestrians held little priority in urban planning, and safety infrastructure lagged far behind the pace of industrial growth. Sidewalks, where they existed at all, were fractured, narrow, or swallowed by neglect. Many people simply walked along the edges of active roadways, exposed to fast-moving traffic with no physical barrier for protection. Collisions were frequent. Deaths were rarely remarkable. The state recorded more pedestrian fatalities from vehicles than nearly any other nation, yet the numbers carried no urgency. Accidents were accepted as an unavoidable byproduct of progress. The burden fell on those on foot to stay out of the way, and to be lucky. So when a motorcycle left the roadway in the industrial town of Nevinomisk during the winter months of 1963, the initial response was muted. Vehicles straying onto pedestrian space was not unheard of. Tragedy in this context was routine. At least that was how it appeared at first. Most people did what they had been conditioned to do. They averted their eyes. They kept moving. A wounded body on the street was not unusual enough to demand intervention, not in a place where accidents were common and accountability was rare. The boy lay pinned beneath the twisted front end of the motorcycle, trapped after the rider, intoxicated and careless, lost control and collapsed into unconsciousness. The machine had come to rest on him. He was still alive. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. He wore the red scarf and uniform of the young pioneers, a symbol meant to represent discipline, innocence, and the future of the state. Very few people stopped. One man did. Witnesses later recalled him as slight, pale, no older than his early 20s. His eyes were sunken and glassy, his posture rigid. While others passed by without slowing, he remained rooted to the sidewalk, crouched low, staring with an intensity that felt wrong even then. Several bystanders remembered noticing him because of how still he was. One described it as a kind of fixation, as though the rest of the street had vanished for him entirely. "I thought he was in shock," one witness later said. "He didn't react to anything around him. He just stayed there shaking." At first, the shaking was assumed to be fear. It wasn't. As the witness stepped closer, the truth became clear and horrifying. The man's attention was not drawn by concern or alarm, but by something far darker. While the boy struggled to breathe beneath the weight of the wreckage, the onlooker remained hidden beneath the branches of a nearby tree, touching himself while watching the boy as the child lay flat on his back, fighting for air. In the future, that same man acknowledged his arousal intensified because no one intervened, giving him the ability to pleasure himself without interference. In his own account, he fixated on the boy's vulnerability, the uniform, the helplessness, the way pain stripped him of composure. He described being overwhelmed by sensations he did not yet understand, sensations he later traced back to a childhood marked by neglect and harm. The child's cries, he said, produced a reaction that eclipsed everything else around him. For a time, the street ceased to exist. Fuel leaked steadily from the ruptured motorcycle, filling the cold air with a sharp chemical odor. He later recalled breathing it in deeply, associating it with the moment rather than the danger. When a small flame sparked near the wreckage, the chaos of the scene escalated, and so did his internal state. By the time sirens echoed in the distance, he had already disengaged. He rose, turned away from the gathering crowd, and walked off without hesitation. A few passers-by noticed something was wrong and looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Emergency vehicles arrived moments later. By then, the man was gone. The motorcyclist eventually staggered upright and bolted down the street, disappearing in the opposite direction. None of the officers present made any effort to pursue him. Their attention didn't linger on the two medics kneeling beside the adolescent either, even though the boy remained pinned beneath the crushed front wheel. It was later revealed why no chase followed. The rider was connected to the police through family ties, and the decision to let him go had been intentional. The young man who had witnessed the entire episode continued walking as authorities pushed the growing crowd back. When he glanced over his shoulder, he saw an officer redirecting traffic around the wreckage. The boy's body had not been moved. His eyes were still open, fixed and vacant, unmistakably lifeless. The sight sent a jolt through the observer, a reaction he recognized but could not indulge openly. With officers sealing off the area, returning to the scene was no longer possible. Instead, he moved farther up the road, stopping at a deserted bus shelter roughly 30 yards away. He sat there in silence, watching from a distance. What held his attention were the boy's unmoving eyes, locked on the dull, overcast sky above. The image rooted itself in his mind, lingering long after the street had been cleared. He would later reflect on the suffering the boy must have endured in the final moments before death, replaying the sequence again and again in his mind. In years that followed, the man described that afternoon as a sexual awakening, a moment that altered the trajectory of his inner life. He said something had been set in motion that day, a compulsion born not from desire alone but from power, proximity, and exposure to violence. What he witnessed, he claimed, awakened an urge he had never encountered before and did not know how to contain. The scene itself became inseparable from that awakening. The chaos, the heat, the sharp odor of fuel in the air, the brief flare of fire, and the boy, immaculate in his pioneer uniform, dressed with care, shoes polished, tie neatly fastened, reduced in seconds from symbol to casualty. From that point on, the man returned to the memory repeatedly, revisiting it in obsessive detail. He admitted that he spent years trying to recreate the intensity of what he had felt in that moment, chasing the same psychological charge through increasingly dangerous behavior. Much later, when attempting to explain it in detached clinical language, he described it as the first time violence, vulnerability, and fixation merged in his mind. He spoke of blood on the pavement, the smell of gasoline and smoke, and an impulse that emerged suddenly and without restraint, an urge to dominate, to cause harm, to reclaim that feeling of control. As with so many events in the Soviet Union at the time, the incident itself dissolved into silence. No one claimed responsibility. No one pressed for answers. The state's obsession with concealment made accountability inconvenient, even undesirable. The absence of consequences shaped everything that followed. There was no intervention from the state, no punishment for crossing lines, no signal that boundaries mattered. The silence of the crowd, their refusal to acknowledge what was happening, reinforced a dangerous conclusion, that invisibility was protection, and that wrongdoing could occur in plain sight without repercussion. That same year, 1961, official records claim that more than 40,000 pedestrians lost their lives on Soviet streets. Even then, many believed the real number far exceeded what was reported. The government's fixation on secrecy ensured that statistics were softened, reshaped, or buried altogether. Admitting failure was viewed as political weakness, ammunition for critics beyond the Iron Curtain. What made this particular incident different was not the collision itself, but what it set in motion. Out of a moment that should have ended as another unexamined tragedy, emerged something far more enduring. The young man who witnessed it would later reinterpret the event as justification, convincing himself that unseen forces had intervened, that the system itself had sanctioned what happened. In his mind, responsibility shifted away from the individual and onto ideology, corruption, and power structures that shielded the guilty. He placed greater blame on the machinery of the state than on the intoxicated rider who caused the crash, a man protected by connections, insulated by influence, and quietly allowed to vanish from accountability. In that distortion, a narrative took root, and from it, something far more dangerous was allowed to grow. For Anatoly Slivko, that day marked a turning point. Years of deprivation, neglect, and brutality had already stripped away trust and empathy, leaving behind something hollow. What he encountered at the roadside did not shock him into reflection. It gave shape to sexual impulses that had been forming for years. From that moment forward, his life became defined by repetition, an obsessive attempt to return to the emotional intensity of that first encounter with violence and sexual excitement. He was born on December 28, 1938, in Izberbash, an oil town in Dagestan near the Caspian Sea. The region was still reeling from the long shadows of war and political upheaval, and recovery was slow, uneven, and unforgiving. It was within this environment, marked by hardship and silence, that the trajectory of his life quietly took form. The region was still reeling from a devastating famine that had swept through just a few years earlier. Slivko was one of many children left weakened by it, thin, frail, and frequently ill. He rarely ate enough to build strength or resilience, and even minor sicknesses lingered longer than they should have. Sleep offered little relief. From an early age, he struggled with severe insomnia, lying awake for hours in a body that never seemed to recover. Many parents in the area were themselves survivors of prolonged starvation. For some, deprivation had so distorted their sense of normalcy that they no longer understood how much food a growing child actually needed. Neglect wasn't always deliberate, but its effects were lasting. As a boy, Slivko was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, a condition that brought with it a range of physical complications and persistent embarrassment. These issues followed him through childhood and adolescence, shaping the way he saw himself and how he believed others saw him. Shame set in early and never really left. Outside of school, he kept to himself, retreating inward and living a largely solitary life with few, if any, friends. That isolation showed in his behavior. Around others, even members of his own family, he appeared tense and awkward, unsure of where he belonged. At school, moments of vulnerability only deepened his humiliation, pushing him further into himself. Classmates kept their distance. He was left alone on the playground, alone during meals, alone in his thoughts. Over time, solitude became his default state. With no one to confide in, no one to challenge or ground his thinking, his inner world began to take over. His imagination became both refuge and echo chamber, unchecked, uncorrected, and increasingly detached from the people around him. Left alone with his thoughts, Slivko's inner world began to fill the gaps left by reality. He retreated inward, constructing imagined spaces that felt safer and more predictable than the life unfolding around him. Fantasy became a refuge, a place where he could escape weakness, hunger, and humiliation. Izberbash offered little to pull him back. The town felt drained of purpose, a place people passed through rather than built futures in. Industry was scarce, farmland limited, and opportunity nearly non-existent. Many of the men traveled long distances for work, commuting to Makhachkala, the regional capital more than 50 kilometers away. What remained behind was a quiet, hollowed-out community marked by absence. At school, Soviet children were taught that strength of will and loyalty could shape not only their own lives, but the fate of the world itself. They were told that perseverance and obedience would lead to greatness. In reality, the message served a narrower purpose, to keep them aligned, unquestioning, and firmly inside the boundaries of the system. While Slivko's father was away fighting on the Eastern Front after the outbreak of the Second World War, those lessons took hold. In classrooms and assemblies, children were immersed in the ideals of sacrifice and duty. From an early age, Slivko was taught that devotion to the state outweighed personal needs, that individual suffering was insignificant when measured against the demands of the motherland. Heroism was glorified. Self-denial was praised. At the same time, suspicion was quietly encouraged. Children were warned that enemies were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, and that vigilance was a moral obligation. That worldview meant outsiders were automatically treated as threats. Anyone unfamiliar was suspect by default. So when German forces entered Slivko's hometown in 1943, the terror for a 5-year-old boy would have been overwhelming. Slivko later recalled a moment when panic took over, when he fled his home convinced bombs were about to fall on his family. He ran without direction, only instinct, until he found himself alone on empty streets, unsure whether he would ever see his parents again. Eventually, he sought refuge in a nearby cemetery. It had been heavily damaged by days of air raids. Graves were torn open, headstones shattered, coffins split and overturned by explosions. The ground itself seemed violated. Other children had gathered there too, drawn by the same desperate instinct to hide among the trees that bordered the burial ground. They knelt together beneath the branches, whispering prayers and clinging to the hope that the bombing would move elsewhere. Years later, Slivko would claim the cemetery had been Jewish, and that this was the reason it had been targeted so relentlessly. The hope didn't last. Not long after they finished praying, the air filled again with the sound of incoming aircraft. Bombs fell across the already ruined cemetery, tearing through the ground once more. For a child already surrounded by hunger, fear, and loss, the experience carved itself deep. Another moment of terror layered onto a life that seemed defined by it. Bombs continued to fall from the blackened sky. Slivko tried to press himself close to a small group of boys nearby, desperate for warmth and safety. They recoiled from him almost immediately, repelled by his frail, skeletal appearance. He was shoved aside and left on his own, crouched against a crumbling wall beside a coffin that had been torn open by the blasts. He curled into himself, rocking slightly, trying to force sleep as a way to disappear. That was when he noticed the street beyond the cemetery, where the body of a woman lay motionless, partially covered by the remains of a dead horse. The sight disturbed him deeply, not because of death itself, but because it shattered something he believed to be true. He had always thought war only claimed men. By then, his own father had been missing for months. No letters, no word. His family assumed what so many others had already accepted, that he had been killed somewhere far away, another name lost to the front lines. When the bombing finally stopped, Slivko stayed where he was, frozen in place, too frightened to move. The image of the woman and the horse wouldn't leave him. He kept wondering whether his father had died the same way, anonymous, broken, left where he fell. Later that day, he made his way back home. His mother and sister were still alive. Years afterward, Slivko admitted that the relief he was supposed to feel never came. Instead, he felt a quiet disappointment. Alone, he had felt calmer, safer. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, isolation had already begun to feel more natural than family. The next morning, he woke to the sharp rhythm of boots striking stone. Outside, a column of German soldiers was moving down the cobbled street. It was the first time he had seen them up close. They didn't resemble the monsters he'd been warned about, at least not in appearance. What caught his attention most were the compact film cameras some of them carried, carefully cradled as they recorded the streets and buildings while advancing through the neighborhood. He also noticed something else that felt unfamiliar. The soldiers laughed openly. They smiled. To a child who had grown up surrounded by fear and restraint, the sight was jarring. Laughter had been rare in his world, something subdued or carefully hidden. Seeing it displayed so casually felt almost unreal. Years later, historians would explain that under Stalin's rule, outward joy was often treated with suspicion. Smiling too freely could be misread as dissent or mockery. People learned to keep their expressions muted, their emotions contained. Happiness, when visible, could invite scrutiny, or worse. Slivko would later say that watching the soldiers pass through his street affected him in ways he didn't fully understand at the time. Their confidence, their appearance, the ease with which they carried themselves, all of it stood in stark contrast to the bleakness he associated with everyday life. In that moment, something about the scene stirred him, offering a brief and troubling lift to his spirits. It was a reaction shaped by deprivation, fear, and confusion. Another small but significant fracture in how he learned to interpret the world around him. They carried polished weapons and immaculate gear, an image that left a strong impression on him. But more than anything else, it was their expressions that held his attention. The ease of their smiles unsettled him. Nothing about what he saw matched what he had been told. He had grown up hearing that these men were monsters, cruel, merciless figures who intended to wipe out the local population and who had already taken his father somewhere on the distant battlefields of the Eastern Front. The contradiction was difficult for a child to process. That fascination didn't last. Slivko had few friends, and his family preferred to keep him indoors, believing it was safer that way. With little else to occupy his time, he began to draw. Again and again he sketched images of German soldiers. Yet on paper they became grotesque. Exaggerated features, distorted faces, teeth too large, expressions twisted into caricature. The drawings reflected the confusion he couldn't put into words. He understood what was expected of him. The soldiers were supposed to be monsters, so that's how he portrayed them, even though part of him doubted the image. By then, he had learned how to please the people around him, especially his mother. She was treated with quiet sympathy by neighbors after the loss of her husband, and Slivko sensed that obedience and conformity mattered more than honesty. The war years left him caught between opposing realities, what he saw, what he was told, and what he was allowed to express. For a child already struggling to understand the world, those contradictions only deepened the divide between his inner thoughts and the version of himself he showed to others. Not long before German forces were pushed out of the town, Slivko later claimed that he and 2 other boys from the neighborhood were taken into nearby woods by armed soldiers. He claimed he was sexually assaulted by the soldiers. Years later, the truth of the account would remain uncertain. Some psychiatrists questioned whether the incident occurred at all, suggesting it may have been shaped, or reshaped, after the fact, a story offered to gain sympathy for the evil he inflicted upon others. Others believed it could not be dismissed so easily. Whether factual or distorted by time and memory, the account fit into a larger pattern, one that helped explain the way violence, power, and vulnerability became intertwined in his thinking as he grew older. Back at school, Slivko continued to withdraw inward. Teachers described him as distracted, distant, lost in his own thoughts. He struggled to keep pace in class, and eventually failed the entrance examination for Moscow State University. He had seen it as his escape, a chance to leave his stagnant hometown behind. He chose to enlist into the army. The army offered no relief. In many ways, it felt no different from school. He was singled out, mocked, and pushed to the margins by other soldiers who sensed his vulnerability and exploited it. Eventually, his superiors decided he wasn't fit for service. Ongoing health issues and concerns about his mental state made him a liability rather than an asset. He was discharged early, labeled as unsuitable for military life. There were quiet insinuations as well. Whispers that he was gay, a word loaded with meaning at the time, hinting at traits the system neither accepted nor discussed openly. When he left the army in the early 1960s, Slivko was in his mid-20s and adrift. He made a deliberate effort to bury parts of himself he didn't understand or didn't want to face. Distance seemed like a solution. He moved hundreds of miles away, settling in Stavropol. a city in southwestern Russia far removed from his childhood town of Izberbash. There, he found work as a telephone engineer and tried to rebuild himself from the ground up. To Slivko, Stavropol felt enormous. Compared to the isolation he'd grown up with, it seemed alive. Crowded streets, constant movement, a sense of possibility. It was one of the largest cities in the North Caucasus, a regional center for industry and culture. Museums dotted the city, housing everything from classical art to relics of war. One even displayed tanks left over from the Second World War, hulking reminders of a past that still loomed close. For the first time in years, Slivko felt as though he'd stepped into a different world, one that promised distraction, structure, and perhaps a chance to outrun himself. Some of the museums even housed full aircraft, suspended from cavernous ceilings like frozen relics of another era. On weekends, Slivko often wandered through the city's botanical garden, watching families pass by with their children. Over time, though, the crowds began to wear on him. He wanted quiet, distance, somewhere he could disappear without being noticed. He started drifting toward the outer edges of the city, where dense pine forests pressed up against the suburbs. There, away from noise and expectation, he spent long stretches alone. Years later, he admitted that those hours in the woods became a retreat into himself. Lying flat in the grass, he would withdraw into his thoughts, letting sexual fantasies play out in the privacy of isolation. Some sense of stability returned when Slivko's younger sister eventually joined him in Stavropol. She recognized how isolated he had become and felt it was her responsibility to draw him back toward a more conventional life. To her, he was still the shy, withdrawn brother who needed structure, guidance, and encouragement to engage with the world. Having heard the rumors that followed him since childhood, she convinced herself that stability was the solution. A wife, a home, a life that appeared normal from the outside. She believed these things could anchor him. She was determined to help him settle, unaware of how deeply entrenched his inner conflicts already were. Late in 1962, she introduced him to a young woman she knew from work, Lyudmila. She warned her in advance that her brother was painfully reserved. Lyudmila noticed immediately, and rather than being put off, she was intrigued. Slivko was unlike the men she knew, quiet, attentive, and restrained. He listened more than he spoke, always seeming preoccupied with his own thoughts. Years later, Slivko would acknowledge that his withdrawal stemmed from a long-standing struggle with his sexual identity, one he had no language for and no safe way to confront in a society where homosexuality was criminalized, stigmatized, and treated as something unspeakable. Slivko married Lyudmila in the summer of 1963. They moved to Nevinomisk, a town roughly 60 miles south of Stavropol. Years later, Slivko would acknowledge that their marriage, which lasted 17 years, was largely distant and restrained. Physical intimacy was rare. Even so, the couple went on to have 2 sons. Only a few months after the fatal traffic accident that he called a sexual awakening, Slivko launched a youth club for boys in Nevinomisk. He called it Chergid. To parents, he appeared to be exactly what he presented himself as: an ordinary Soviet man, patient and well-meaning, someone who cared about discipline and guidance. Many were relieved to leave their sons in his care. Slivko said his goal was to teach the boys structure, responsibility, and the right way to grow into adulthood. The children who attended reminded him of the boy he had seen die in the street, young, trusting, unguarded. Surrounded by them, he felt a pull he did not question, telling himself it was purpose, mentorship, belonging. The steady flow of boys through the club gave him a sense of access and control he had never known before. Slivko began forming close, deliberate relationships with certain boys. At the same time, his standing in the neighborhood continued to grow. The amateur films he'd made about the war years won local awards, elevating his reputation even further. Inside the club, his attention settled on boys between the ages of 13 and 17, many of them smaller, slighter, younger-looking than their peers. Parents praised him openly. They saw a man sacrificing his time for children who needed extra guidance, especially those with behavioral problems. Slivko organized hiking trips for the boys he favored most, presenting himself as patient, attentive, and deeply invested in their lives. The boys trusted him, their parents trusted him even more. Letters of gratitude poured in. Local party officials issued certificates recognizing his contribution to youth development. He was invited onto local radio and television programs and began writing regularly for regional newspapers. To the outside world, Anatoly Slivko had become a model citizen, an educator, a mentor, a man doing good work. And with every layer of praise and protection added around him, he became harder to question. He began telling parents that the club would stage historical reenactments from the Second World War. The boys, he said, would help reconstruct scenes of partisan resistance and military sacrifice. These performances would require special rehearsals, physical preparation meant to build endurance, toughness, and character. He framed it as training that would help turn boys into men. Slivko targeted the smallest boys, selling both them and their parents on a fabricated health regimen. He presented the staged suspensions as a form of corrective therapy, insisting the process would lengthen the spine, strengthen the body, and enhance breathing capacity. Compliance was framed as medical necessity. The children were instructed to abstain from food for several hours beforehand to ensure the treatment worked properly. Under this guise, he drilled them in elaborate reenactments of wartime executions, carefully choreographing scenes that mimicked the deaths of captured partisans. At the back of the clubhouse, Slivko built a crude stage. It was meant to resemble a wartime execution site, complete with improvised props and uniforms. These rehearsals were never public. They took place only when no one else was around, just Slivko and a single boy at a time. The children were dressed in young pioneers' uniforms, polished shoes, pressed white shirts, red neckerchiefs. The image mattered to him. It echoed the boy he had watched die years earlier, the memory that never loosened its grip. He instructed them to place ropes around their own necks, assuring them it was safe, that he knew first aid, that he would bring them back if anything went wrong. He tightened the rope just long enough for them to lose consciousness. Once out cold, he undressed each boy, then touched them inappropriately, capturing it all on video. He'd make each boy pose in provocative ways before pleasuring himself. Once finished, he'd revive them. Shortly after, Slivko convinced a boy they needed to film a scene deep in the woods away from others. He instructed the boy to tie the noose around his neck. Then Slivko pulled the ladder out from his feet. Once the boy lost consciousness, Slivko pleasured himself and left his seed on the boy's shoes. Once the boy regained consciousness, he was oblivious to what happened. Slivko insisted, even after his arrest, that he never meant to kill anyone. But the line he was walking was always lethal. On June 2, 1964, he took 15-year-old Nikolai Dobryshev into the woods, as he had done with others before. This time, the boy did not regain consciousness. Slivko claimed he tried to revive him. Investigators were unconvinced. When he realized the boy was dead, Slivko destroyed the body, burning and burying what remained. One detective later described it not as panic, but cowardice, an attempt to erase the evidence so he wouldn't have to confront what he'd done. Experts believe the killing marked a turning point. What had begun as ritualized abuse became something more permanent. Slivko kept Nikolai's shoes afterward, whether as a token of guilt or a trophy was never fully resolved. Most believe it was both. Though he claimed to have destroyed the film he recorded that day, psychiatrists later concluded that the boy's death intensified his compulsions rather than repelled him. He admitted the experience affected him more deeply than anything before it. Nikolai's parents were told their son had likely run away. Police never seriously considered Slivko as a suspect. He was, after all, a respected community figure. Just months later, he selected another boy from the club, Alexei Lyosha Kovalenko. The outcome was the same. Again, the family was told their child had run away. Again, Slivko was shielded by reputation and denial. Realizing he couldn't continue targeting boys directly connected to the club without risking exposure, Slivko began seeking victims elsewhere. Over the next decade, how many children he harmed or killed remains unknown. As one profiler later put it, Men like him don't simply stop. As long as there is opportunity and silence, the violence continues. Many of his victims were likely written off as runaways. They were never counted. Over the previous 5 years, he had amassed a collection of old cameras. Rather than destroying the recordings, as he claimed to have done after his first killing, he kept them. The footage accumulated into a private archive that he returned to repeatedly, using it to relive what he had done. Some psychiatrists later suggested that Slivko believed revisiting the recordings might satisfy his compulsions enough to keep him from acting again. Others were far less convinced. One expert argued that the films were never meant to stop his behavior, only to supplement it. Those recordings were not a substitute, the psychiatrist explained. They were an extension. Like many offenders who rely on recorded material, revisiting it only increased his appetite for more extreme acts. Each viewing pushed him further, not closer to restraint. The footage served another purpose as well. Slivko treated it as a kind of rehearsal tool, studying his own actions to refine them. He later admitted during psychiatric evaluation that reviewing the films taught him how to avoid mistakes and minimize traces that could lead investigators back to him. Rather than deterring him, this process reinforced his confidence and encouraged him to continue. At one point, Slivko became openly contemptuous of law enforcement. When officers arrived at the youth club to question staff about the last boy seen before his disappearance, Slivko remarked to a colleague that the police were incompetent. At that stage, investigators still had no physical evidence. None of the missing children's remains had been found, and detectives continued to insist the boys had simply run away. The reality was that Novino Misk police were stretched thin, poorly paid, overburdened, and overwhelmed by a steady stream of cases. No sooner would one missing child investigation begin than another report would arrive, forcing officers to shift their attention yet again. Between 1975 and the early 1980s, Slivko expanded his targeting beyond the boys enrolled in his club, believing this reduced the risk of scrutiny. By then, killing had become compulsive. Even so, he struggled to completely restrain himself from harming children still under his supervision. In the summer of 1984, during a rehearsal for one of his staged productions, Slivko rendered 13-year-old Sergei Fatsiev unconscious. The boy never regained awareness. Slivko later disposed of the remains. When Sergei failed to return home, police again told his parents that their son must have run away. His mother refused to accept that explanation. She began speaking directly with boys who attended the club. Several told her that Slivko had made them lose consciousness during supposed experiments, which he claimed were meant to help them grow taller. None could explain what had happened while they were unconscious. Convinced Slivko was responsible for her son's disappearance, Mrs. Fatsiev repeatedly urged police to reopen the case. Her appeals were dismissed. In later years, allegations surfaced that Slivko had bribed investigators to avoid arrest, despite mounting circumstantial evidence linking him to multiple disappearances. Those claims were never definitively proven. Slivko, for his part, was confident. Without bodies, he believed the authorities would never act. He had ensured that the remains of his victims were destroyed beyond recognition, even if they were ever discovered. In the autumn of 1984, he killed another club member, 15-year-old Vyacheslav Kovistik. The following year, he murdered 13-year-old Sergei Pavlov, who vanished after telling a neighbor he was meeting the leader of Chergid for a rehearsal. That disappearance finally forced a shift. Police and prosecutors began treating Slivko as their primary suspect. Within days, investigators intensified surveillance of his movements and activities. In early December 1985, a search warrant was issued to search the youth club, while undercover officers monitored Slivko at his home, waiting for confirmation to make the arrest. Inside the building, detectives discovered a concealed room at the rear. Forcing entry, they found ropes, cutting tools, and numerous pairs of children's shoes. They also recovered photographs and snuff films documenting his crimes, some dating back more than 2 decades to the earliest period of his violence. At the time, investigators did not realize that Slivko had already destroyed significant portions of this material. including footage connected to his first known killing in 1964. In other cases, he had reused tapes, recording newer crimes over earlier ones. He routinely reused his recordings whenever they no longer held his interest. In one segment recovered by investigators, he appeared deliberately arranging human remains into a ritualized display, placing a severed head at the center, encircled by dismembered feet and a pair of carefully shined boots. The arrangement echoed the young pioneer uniform, a detail investigators later linked to the schoolboy killed in the earlier road accident that had so deeply affected him. Members of the youth club eventually told police that Slivko's so-called experiments on boys had been going on for decades. By the end of the search, detectives had gathered sufficient evidence to tie him directly to the murders of at least 7 children, all between the ages of 11 and 15. Several miles away from the clubhouse, undercover officers surrounded Slivko's family home and moved in. They persuaded him to step outside quietly, avoiding a scene that would involve his wife and children. Once in custody, Slivko began speaking almost immediately. During the drive to police headquarters, he started admitting to the killings, stating with unsettling candor that none of his victims had been older than 17. That evening, during his first formal interrogation, Slivko told detectives that his actions had been driven by a desire to recreate the traffic accident he had witnessed years earlier. When one investigator suggested he may have targeted younger boys because older teens might resist, Slivko dismissed the idea outright. He insisted he had never needed force. "They were completely under my control," he said. Over the following days, Slivko led authorities to the remains of 6 murdered boys. He was unable, however, to identify the precise location where he had disposed of his first victim, 15-year-old Nikolai Dobryshev, whom he continued to describe as an accidental death dating back to June 2, 1964. Prosecutors charged him with 7 counts of murder, along with multiple counts of sexual assault and necrophilia. Exactly 22 years after that first killing, Slivko stood trial in Nevinomisk. He claimed that the deaths were unintended outcomes of failed experiments. The court rejected his explanation. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, detectives from across Russia traveled to interview him, hoping he might offer insight into other offenders who were still at large. Slivko was eager to participate. Some officers believed his cooperation was sincere. Others suspected it was simply another attempt to delay his sentence. In practical terms, his assistance led to few arrests. Even so, his conversations gave investigators a disturbing glimpse into how he rationalized his actions. One detective described listening to Slivko dissect another killer's behavior for a Siberian investigative team. He spoke calmly, analytically, almost like an academic, nothing like the man responsible for such violence. Investigators allowed him to talk at length, hoping he might reveal something unintentionally. Eventually, he did. While discussing another case, Slivko let slip details of a murder he had previously denied committing. In September 1989, while held on death row at Novocherkassk prison, Slivko was again approached by detectives seeking his help on an unrelated serial case. This time, it became clear his cooperation had only one goal: postponing his execution for as long as possible. Authorities ended the interviews soon afterward. Within days, the sentence was carried out using the standard method of the time: a single shot to the back of the head. Some relatives of the victims had asked to be present, even to carry out the act themselves.